Hey there, and welcome back. If you have come here tonight from the kind of day that asks for a soft landing, settle in slowly. Find the position you want to be in. Adjust the pillow under your head if you have not already. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you. And if you enjoy these cozy journeys through history, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Whether you're here to drift into sleep or to follow the currents of history, I'm glad you're with me. Pull the blanket up to whatever height suits you. Close your eyes if you want, or leave them open in the dim, if that is your preference. The story tonight does not require any particular posture from you. It only requires that you let yourself drift, by small, steady degrees, into the quiet country that the words are going to take you into. Tonight, I want to take you into an evening at a country estate. Not a specific country estate, not the seat of a famous duke that you might recognize the name of, not a real house that exists in any guidebook or any history. Tonight, the house is going to be a particular but unnamed house in the green rolling country of the English Midlands, and you are going to be a guest in it, and the evening is going to unfold around you with the slow, unforced ease of an evening at a country house in late September of the year 1817. The exact location does not matter. The house is going to be the kind of house that England produced in considerable numbers between roughly 1700 and roughly 1820. A substantial gentleman's seat of brick and stone with a park of perhaps 800 acres around it. A small lake with a Doric temple at the far end, an ancient parish church just outside the park gates, a deer enclosure, a walled kitchen garden, a stable yard, a home farm, and the considerable inside establishment of an English country house in its full Hanoverian completeness. You are going to be a guest in this house for the next several days. You arrived 3 days ago. You are settled in. You know the rhythm of the household. You have a bedroom and a personal maid and a place at the dinner table and a small set of habits that you have already established. The evening I want to take you into is the evening of your 4th full day in the house, the 3rd evening of the small house party that the family is hosting. An entirely ordinary evening with no special drama in it. The kind of evening that you will look back on, in years to come, as one of the small representative evenings of the late summer of your life. Before I take you into the evening itself, let me set the scene a little, because the world a country estate inhabits in 1795 is a world that the modern imagination tends to picture inaccurately, with too much of the Regency romance gloss, and not enough of the actual quiet substance. And I want you to be inside the right kind of country tonight rather than the imagined one. The year is 1817. Lord Liverpool is Prime Minister, and has been since the assassination of Mr. Percival 5 years ago. King George III, now nearly 80 and entirely lost to the strange illness that has troubled him since 1788, lives in seclusion at Windsor under the care of his doctors and has not been seen in public for some years. The Prince of Wales, his eldest son, has been formally regent for the past 6 years and rules in his father's place from Carlton House and the new pavilion at Brighton, in the slightly tawdry magnificence that the regent's establishment has settled into. Britain has been at peace for 2 years, since the final defeat of the Emperor Napoleon at Waterloo in June of 1815 ended the long wars with France that had filled the past 2 decades. The country is still adjusting to the peace. The price of corn has fallen since the war ended. The agricultural districts are uneasy. The manufacturing towns of the north are uneasier still. But the Midlands countryside in which you are sitting tonight is settled in the slow, comfortable rhythm of a long-established agricultural neighbourhood, and the small worries of the larger national situation have not, this evening, reached this particular corner of England in any visible way. The harvest has been brought in. The hops have been picked in the southern counties. The hunting season has not quite begun. The Michaelmas quarter day, the 29th of September, is just past, and the country attorneys and stewards have been busy with the autumn settling of accounts, the paying of rents, the collecting of tithes, the small, careful annual readjustment of the country's economic life. The London season ended in June. The fashionable world has been at the country seats and the watering places since then. Bath has been doing its summer business. Brighton, where the Regent has been spending much of the summer at his expanding pavilion, has been the centre of the most fashionable summer society. Smaller spas like Tunbridge Wells and Cheltenham have been doing their share. The grand country families have been holding their summer house parties in the slow, comfortable way that summer house parties were held in the years just after Waterloo. And the small house party that you are part of tonight is one of perhaps thousands of similar small parties happening across the country at this same season. The house you are in tonight was built in the late 1720s by the great-grandfather of the current owner. The great-grandfather had been a man of moderate fortune who had married well, increased his estate by careful purchases of neighbouring properties across 30 years, and had finally, in his late 40s, decided that the rambling old Jacobean house on the property was no longer suitable for a family of his rising standing. He had pulled it down. He had commissioned a new house from a London architect of moderate reputation in the recently fashionable Palladian style that Lord Burlington and his circle had been promoting since the 1710s. The new house had been built across about 7 years, between 1726 and 1733, of pale local sandstone with brick infill in the upper stories, with a central block of 3 bays and 2 wings projecting forward to enclose a small entrance court. The main reception rooms had been laid out on the first floor in the Italian fashion, with a grand staircase leading up from the entrance hall to the piano nobile, and the secondary rooms had been distributed across the ground floor and the second floor according to their importance. The whole house, when it had been completed, had cost something close to £15,000, which was a very considerable sum in 1733, but which the great-grandfather had been able to find without difficulty. The house had then been improved in the later 18th century by the grandfather and the father of the current owner. The grandfather had added the library wing on the east side, which had been built in the 1750s in a slightly more decorated Rococo style than the original house, and which contained the family's collection of about 6,000 books built up across 2 generations. The father had, in the 1770s, called in Mr. Brown, the great Capability Brown himself, to redesign the park, and Mr. Brown had done at this estate what he had done at 50 other English estates in the same period: removed the formal terraces near the house, swept the grass right up to the walls, dug a small lake about 1/4 of a mile from the south front, planted scattered clumps of beech and oak across the middle distance, contrived the small Doric temple at the far end of the lake as a focal point for the eye, and produced the rolling pastoral park that the house now sat in. The grandfather and the father had also, between them, redecorated the principal rooms in the lighter neoclassical style that had come into fashion since the original 1730s decoration, with painted ceilings and pale plasterwork, and the new light furniture that the Adam brothers and their imitators had been making since the 1760s. The house, therefore, that you are sitting in tonight is a house with a particular architectural character. It is Palladian in its bones, neoclassical in its surface, with the slightly older, heavier feeling of the 1730s underlying the lighter and more airy decoration of the 1760s and 1770s. The proportions are good. The rooms are well lit. The principal bedrooms are large and comfortable. The servants' quarters are extensive. The whole establishment runs on the well-oiled rhythms of a country house that has been running on the same rhythms for 60 years. I want to spend a few minutes, before I take you any further, on the scale of the house itself, because the scale is one of the things that the modern imagination most consistently fails to picture accurately, and one of the things that an actual guest in 1817 would have been most struck by, and indeed has been struck by across the past 3 days of your visit. The house is enormous. That is the simplest way to put it. The principal block, ignoring the wings, is 110 feet long and 70 feet deep, rising 3 stories above the ground level with an attic floor above that and a basement floor below ground. The 2 wings projecting forward from the principal block extend another 60 feet each, with the library wing on the east side rising 2 stories with its own internal mezzanine floor and the service wing on the west side running back somewhat further than the library wing, because the service wing also contains, on its lower level, the great kitchen complex that supplies the household. The whole house, from the easternmost end of the library wing to the westernmost end of the service wing, measures over 240 feet across its widest span. The total floor area, when one adds together every inhabited and partly inhabited level, comes to something close to 50,000 square feet under one continuous roof. The number of rooms is correspondingly large. Lady Lacey, who keeps the household inventory and who is the only person in the house who actually knows the answer with precision, would tell you that the house contains 87 rooms of different sizes. Of these, perhaps 30 are the principal family and entertainment rooms on the ground and first floors. Another 15 are the family bedrooms and dressing rooms on the first and second floors. The remaining 20-odd are the servants' bedrooms in the attic, the servants' working rooms in the basement, and the various small specialized rooms that a great country house establishment requires. The still room where the housekeeper makes the household's preserves and cordials, the still-room maid's bedroom adjacent, the brushing room where the men servants brush down the gentleman's clothes each morning, the linen room where the household linen is stored, the lamp room where the lamps are cleaned and refilled each morning, the boot room where the muddy outdoor boots are scraped and cleaned, the gun room where the baronet's collection of guns is kept and where the powder and shot are stored under lock, the small estate office where the steward keeps the records of the rents and the accounts of the home farm, the muniment room where the family papers and the title deeds going back to the 17th century are stored in their iron-bound chests, the small servants' hall where the upper servants take their meals, the larger servants' hall where the under-servants take theirs, the great kitchen, the small kitchen, the scullery where the dishes are washed, the larder, the cold larder, the meat larder, the dairy maid's room, the laundry maid's room, the bakehouse, the brewhouse. The number of small specialized rooms in a great country house in 1817 is one of the things that most surprises a visitor who has not been in such a house before, because the modern mind, which is used to multi-purpose rooms in smaller houses, has lost the sense of just how many separate functions a great household required and how many separate rooms were given to each. The corridors that connect all of these rooms are correspondingly long. The main corridor on the first floor, which runs the length of the south front from the head of the great staircase to the small staircase at the west end, is over 100 feet long. The corridor on the same floor running the length of the north side of the principal block is another 100 feet. The corridors of the two wings are shorter but still substantial. The total length of corridor on the first floor alone, if one were to walk every foot of it, would be over 400 feet. On the ground floor, and the second floor and the attic and the basement, the figures are similar. The total length of corridor in the house, end to end, exceeds 2,000 feet, which is well over a third of a mile of indoor walking surface. The staircases of the house are correspondingly numerous. The great staircase in the center is the principal one used by the family and their guests. The smaller secondary staircase that connects the entrance hall to the first floor reception rooms is the one you came down for the dinner an hour ago. The back staircase in the service wing is the one the servants use to go up and down between the kitchen complex in the basement and the dining room on the ground floor. The narrower servants' staircase in the east wing is the one the chambermaids use to come up to the bedroom floors with the morning hot water and the evening warming pans. There is another small spiral stair in the corner of the library wing that goes up to the mezzanine. There is an attic staircase at each end of the principal block that connects the second floor to the servants' bedrooms above. There are 7 separate staircases in the house in all, distributed across the various sections of the establishment, allowing the family and the servants to move through the building without crossing each other's paths, and allowing the various working parts of the household to operate without interfering with one another. The roof of the house, when one stands on the lawn and looks up, is itself an enormous structure. The lead roofs of the principal block alone cover something close to half an acre. The chimney stacks rising from the roof are 43 in number, serving the more than 60 separate fireplaces distributed through the house. On a cold winter evening, with every fireplace in the principal rooms lit, and the servants' fires lit in the basement, and the bedroom fires lit on the upper floors, the smoke rising from those 43 chimneys is visible from the village beyond the park gates 1.5 miles away, and is one of the small distinctive features of the country evening for the villagers who have lived their lives within sight of the great house. The cellars beneath the house go down 2 stories below the ground level. The upper cellars contain the working basements of the household, the kitchen, the larders, the various working rooms I have already mentioned. The lower cellars, deep below the ground, contain the wine cellars, the small ice house that holds the ice cut each winter from the lake, the small coal cellar that holds the household's annual supply of coal, and the various small storage rooms for the things the household needs to keep cold or dark or away from the rest of the establishment. The wine cellars, which the baronet takes a particular interest in, contain something close to 4,000 bottles of wine in their various bins, distributed across the small vaulted chambers in the careful arrangement that the family's butler has been maintaining for 30 years. The whole underground complex is its own small subterranean village, with its own small distinctive cool damp smell, its own internal corridors, its own small dim lighting from the high small windows that admit the ground level light through the basement areas around the house. The number of people required to run this establishment is correspondingly large. The indoor servants of the house number 42 in all, distributed across the various departments. The butler, the under-butler, the senior footman, the junior footman, the valet of the baronet, the page, the steward's room boy, the housekeeper, the senior housemaid, the under-housemaids, the laundry maids, the still-room maid, the dairy maid, the lady's maid of the present lady of the house, the cook, the kitchen maid, the under-kitchen maid, the scullery maid, the dairy maid for the kitchen dairy. The men of the stable and the gardens are not counted in the indoor staff, but if one were to count them, one would add another 12 men of the stable, 8 men and boys of the gardens, 4 the home farm, the gamekeeper and his assistant, the head forester and his apprentice, the bailiff who manages the estate's outdoor business, and various other outdoor workers and casual labourers who came and went on a daily basis. The total number of people whose daily livelihood depended on the establishment of the great house, when one added all of this together, was perhaps 80 souls, with the indirect dependents, including the wives and children of the married servants, extending the figure to well over 200. This is the scale, then, of the establishment you are sitting in. A house of 87 rooms, a roof of 1/2 acre, 43 chimneys, 60 fireplaces, 2,000 feet of indoor corridor, 7 separate staircases, 4,000 bottles of wine in the cellars, 42 indoor servants, an 800-acre park around it, a village of 200 souls dependent on it. The whole arrangement, organized around the daily life of a single family of perhaps 6 people who, with the addition of their occasional guests like yourself, occupy at most 10 or 12 of the 87 rooms on any given day. The contrast between the scale of the establishment and daily occupation is, when one thinks about it, one of the most striking features of country house life. The family use, in their daily round, perhaps 1/10 of the rooms of the house. The other 9/10 sit empty, kept up by the servants in the small steady way that a great house requires, with fires lit periodically to keep the damp out, with the dust covers off and on according to the season, with the small careful maintenance that a great empty house requires to remain habitable when it is finally needed. The state bedchamber on the first floor of the principal block, originally laid out for a possible visit from royalty in the 1730s, has not been slept in for over 50 years, but is still kept made up and ready, with fresh linen on the great bed once a month, and the fire lit once a fortnight in the cold months. The great state dining room on the ground floor, used perhaps 3 times a year for the largest entertainments, sits empty for most of the year, with the great mahogany table polished once a week and the chandeliers cleaned once a month. The long gallery on the second floor of the principal block, running 90 feet from end to end and lined with the family portraits going back to the early 17th century, is used by the family only as a passage between the south wing and the north wing on the upper floor, and the rest of the time it sits in its dim, quiet way, with the long line of ancestors looking out from their gilt frames at no one in particular. You yourself, in your 3 days at the house, have been in perhaps 15 of the 87 rooms. The principal entrance hall, the smaller entrance hall above, the great drawing room, the morning room, the library, the breakfast room, the dining room, the small drawing room you take tea in, the state staircase, the corridor of the first floor, your own bedroom, your own dressing room, the chapel, which you visited briefly the second morning to look at it, the conservatory, which you visited the first afternoon to see the late grapes, and one of the small ground floor sitting rooms which you happened into by accident on the second day looking for Mrs. Lacey and which you have not been in since. The other 70 or so rooms of the house you have not seen, they exist around you on every side, as the great quiet body of the house in which the small inhabited heart of it is set. You can feel them, you cannot see them. They give the inhabited rooms the particular quality of being held inside a very much larger structure, the small lit centre of a vast dim periphery. This is one of the central things about country house living that the imagination needs to grasp, the smallness of what is in use, against the vastness of what is there. The few warm lit rooms against the many cold dim ones. The handful of people against the cubic acres of building that contain them. The particular quality that this disproportion produces, it is a quality of being held inside something far larger than oneself, of being a small bright presence in a great dim continuity, of moving through the inhabited part with the steady awareness of the uninhabited parts pressing in on every side. It is a particular kind of safety. You have been feeling this quality for 3 days. You have been feeling it tonight in the warm bedroom with the small fire and the small candles, with the great house extending in every direction around you in its dim, quiet way, and the great park extending in every direction around the house, and the great quiet country extending in every direction around the park. You are at this moment the small lit centre of a series of nested vast quiets. The corridor outside is dim and longer. The corridors beyond that are darker and longer still. The unused rooms are dimmer and emptier. The state apartments are empty and cold. The roof above is vast and dark. The whole structure, with you at its small lit centre, holds you in the particular kind of containment that only an English country house at night could produce. I want, before I take you any further into the evening, to spend a little time on what is actually inside this enormous house. Because the house is not simply a vast empty shell, the house, across the past 90 years, has been steadily accumulating the small physical accumulations that 90 years of substantial country house living produce. The rooms of the establishment are filled with the slow, steady deposits of 3 generations of country gentlemen and their wives buying, inheriting, and arranging the small contents of an English country house in its long Hanoverian and Regency prime. The contents are, in their way, as remarkable as the building itself. The richness of the contents is one of the central pleasures of being in a house of this kind, and I want to give you enough of a sense of it that you can feel, as you lie in your warm bed, in your warm room, the small steady pressure of the accumulated wealth of the establishment around you. Begin with the portraits. The long gallery on the second floor of the principal block, which I mentioned earlier, is the principal repository of the family portraits, and it contains, at this hour of the night, with the candles unlit, and the moonlight from the west windows falling in pale shafts across the polished oak floor, the slow accumulated visual record of 3 centuries of the family. The portraits then progress, decade by decade, through the 17th century. The first surviving portrait of any quality is a Caroline period likeness from the 1630s, of a great-great-great-grandfather in the long curls and lace collar of the Stuart court, painted by a follower of Van Dyck. There is a Cromwellian period portrait of a younger son who served in the parliamentary army, in his buff coat and his small, severe lace collar. There is a Restoration period portrait of the first ancestor who came back into favour after 1660, in his long, full-bottomed wig and his velvet coat, painted by Sir Peter Lely in the 1670s. With the slight characteristic flatness of Lely's later studio work, but with a real likeness underneath. There is a portrait of his wife, also by Lely, in the soft satin dress and the slightly too elaborate jewellery that all of Lely's society women wore. There is a Williamite period portrait of the man who would become the first baronet, painted around 1700 by Sir Godfrey Kneller in the more confident style of the new century. Then come the 18th century portraits, which are the heart of the collection. The first baronet, in his full-length state portrait of around 1715, painted by Kneller in the year the baronetcy was created, in his dark velvet coat with the small gold-trimmed waistcoat and the small jewelled order at his breast, looking out from the canvas with the slightly cautious expression of a man who has just been raised to a hereditary dignity and is not yet entirely sure how to wear it. The second baronet, in a portrait by Allan Ramsay of around 1750, in the lighter and more confident style of the mid-18th century, in a coat of pale blue silk with silver braid, his hand resting on a small marble bust on a side table. The third baronet, in a magnificent full-length portrait by Sir Joshua Reynolds of around 1775, in his peer's robes for the opening of Parliament that year, in the deep crimson and ermine of the period, with the small, distinguished expression of a man who knew he had reached the full position to which his family had been climbing for 2 centuries. The third baronet's wife, in a companion portrait by Reynolds, in a soft white silk gown and her own pearls, with a small spaniel at her feet. The present baronet, in his portrait by John Hopner of around 1798, in the slightly more relaxed Regency style. Beside these full-length portraits, the gallery contains perhaps 30 smaller portraits of the various other members of the family and their connections across the same period. There are double portraits of children, in the small, charming style that the 18th century did so well, with small figures in their small white silk dresses holding small dogs or small dolls. There are portraits of various wives and sisters and aunts and cousins, each in the fashion of her period, the powdered hair of the 1760s giving way to the simpler natural hair of the 1780s, and that giving way to the high-waisted Regency styles of the present decade. There are several small portraits of ancestors painted as miniatures on ivory, in their delicate gilt and glass cases, hung in clusters at intervals along the walls. There is a small bust of the second baronet, in white marble, on a small pedestal at the centre of the gallery. There is on the far wall a single very large picture that is not a family portrait, but that the second baronet bought in Italy on his grand tour in the 1730s. A Venetian view of the Grand Canal by Canaletto, in its heavy gilt frame, showing the church of Santa Maria della Salute across the water in the soft pearl light of a Venetian morning. The Canaletto, which would today be the most valuable single object in the house, has been hanging in the Long Gallery for 85 years. The portraits in the Long Gallery are only the beginning of the picture collection. The principal reception rooms contain another 100-odd pictures, distributed across the walls in the careful arrangements that successive ladies of the house have worked out across the decades. The great drawing room contains the family portraits I described to you earlier. The dining room contains a second tier of family portraits of the various ancestors who had not made it into the Long Gallery, alongside a small group of Dutch and Flemish still-life paintings of fruit and game that the present baronet's grandfather bought in the 1750s. The library contains a series of small Italian landscapes by Italian and English followers of Claude Lorraine and Gaspard Duguet, distributed between the bookshelves. The smaller drawing room contains a series of family miniatures and several small oil sketches by Reynolds that the family has somehow accumulated. The morning room contains a pair of small Gainsborough landscapes of soft English country scenes that the present lady of the house's father gave her on her marriage. The breakfast room contains several small flower paintings and a series of bird prints from a recent natural history publication. Even the corridors and the staircases are hung. The walls of the great staircase carry the long line of full-length ancestor portraits I described earlier in the script, with their slightly stiff dynastic dignity. The corridors of the bedroom floors carry smaller portraits and prints. There are, in all, somewhere between 250 and 300 individual pictures distributed across the house, in the small, steady accumulation of 3 generations of family collecting. Beside the pictures, the house contains the small accumulated wealth of 3 generations of country gentlemen who have been buying objects across the 18th century. The library, which I have already mentioned briefly, contains 6,000 volumes distributed across the floor-to-ceiling shelves of the long room, in a collection that the 3rd baronet had been particularly active in building, and that the present baronet has continued at a slower pace. The collection includes the standard great works of English literature in the small calf-bound editions of the period, the principal works of classical Greek and Latin literature in their various scholarly editions, a substantial section of works of natural history and travel and antiquarian writing, a complete set of the Encyclopedia of Diderot and d'Alembert that the 3rd baronet bought in Paris in 1772, the major works of the great 18th century historians, a collection of about 600 volumes of plays and pamphlets, and the small but distinguished collection of incunabula and early printed books that the 3rd baronet had been buying at the great London book sales of the 1770s and 1780s. The library, in its book content alone, is one of the more distinguished private libraries in the country, although the family does not particularly think of it as such. The dining service that you have just been eating off was the principal porcelain dinner service of the house, made for the family by the Worcester Porcelain Factory in 1782 to a special order, in a pattern of soft cobalt blue and gilt that the present lady of the house's mother chose at the time. The service consists of 240 pieces in all, distributed across the various functions: large platters, small platters, soup tureens, sauce boats, vegetable dishes, dinner plates, soup plates, dessert dishes, and the various small odd pieces that a great formal dinner service requires. The service is kept in a special glass-fronted cabinet in the butler's pantry, where it is washed by hand by the senior footman after each use and returned to its precise position in the cabinet. Beside the Great Worcester service, the house contains another 4 lesser services for the various smaller occasions: an everyday creamware service for ordinary breakfasts, a small Wedgwood service that the family uses for tea, a fine Sèvres dessert service that the 3rd baronet bought in Paris in the 1770s, and that is brought out only for the most important dinners, and a small Chinese export porcelain service of the older 18th century blue and white that the family has had since the 2nd baronet's time, and that is now used principally for the children when they come up from the nursery for their meals. The silver plate of the house, which is kept locked in the small strong room next to the butler's pantry, is the accumulated silver of 3 generations. It includes the great formal pieces, the large silver tureen made by Paul de Lamery in 1740 that is brought out for the soup at large dinners, the pair of large silver candelabra by Paul Storr from 1812 that are placed on the dining table for state occasions, the great silver epinette, with its complicated arrangement of branches and small dishes that takes the centre of the table at the largest entertainments. It includes the smaller individual pieces, accumulated across the decades: silver salt cellars, silver mustard pots, silver pepper pots, silver sauce boats, silver entree dishes, the long line of individual silver place settings consisting of knife, fork, spoon, soup spoon, dessert knife, dessert fork, There are several dozen complete settings of the family's monogrammed silver, kept in the long velvet-lined drawers of the silver chest. There are silver tea services, silver coffee services, silver chocolate pots, silver punch bowls, silver communion plate from the chapel that has been kept in the strong room since the chapel ceased to be in regular weekly use 40 years ago. The total weight of the silver plate of the house, if it were melted down, would come to several £100 in weight and would be worth, in the bullion value alone, perhaps £1,000 sterling. Its value as work silver is many times that. The crystal glassware of the house is similarly accumulated. The cut glass decanters that you have seen on the dining table tonight are part of a set of 48 that the second baronet's wife bought in 1775 from one of the great Stourbridge glass houses, and that the family has been using at every major dinner since. The wine glasses on the table are part of a set of 72 that the present lady of the house ordered when she was first married. The dessert glasses, the champagne glasses, the small cordial glasses, the tumblers for the morning water, the small jelly glasses, the wine coolers, the great decanters for the port, the smaller decanters for the Madeira. Every glass on every table in the house is part of a set kept in its proper cupboard in the proper part of the building, with a complete inventory that the housekeeper maintains. The textiles of the house are correspondingly extensive. The linen press in the housekeeper's storeroom contains on its long, deep shelves the entire household linen of the establishment, hundreds of fine Irish linen sheets in graded sizes for the various beds, hundreds of pillowcases, hundreds of damask tablecloths in graded sizes for the various tables, hundreds of damask napkins to match each tablecloth, the towels for the various washstands, the small linen squares for the toilet tables, the ceremonial linen for the chapel that is brought out only for the rare services held there. The household linen of a great country house in 1817 represented a substantial capital investment. The Irish linen sheets alone, made of the finest grade of cambric linen, cost something close to £2 a pair when new, and the family kept enough sheets in stock to make up every bed in the house twice over, and to provide for several rounds of laundry rotation. The total linen stock of the house was worth perhaps £800, which was the equivalent of the annual income of a comfortable country clergyman, and was kept under the careful management of the housekeeper with the small, steady attention that such a valuable stock required. Beside the linen, the house contains the various silk and wool textiles of the soft furnishings, the silk damask curtains and bed hangings in the principal rooms, the heavier wool damask in the secondary rooms, the brocaded silks of the upholstery on the formal chairs and sofas, the velvets on the older chairs from the 18th century, the embroidered silk panels that the present lady of the house's grandmother had worked over a period of several years, and that hang in the smaller drawing-room. There is the great 17th century tapestry in the chapel of the marriage at Cunna that the second baronet bought from a London dealer around 1740, and that has been hanging in its current position for nearly 80 years. There are the smaller tapestries in the corridors of the bedroom floors, of pastoral scenes and small biblical episodes. There are the carpets, the great Axminster in the drawing-room I described, the older Persian rugs in the various rooms, the small antique Turkish carpets in the bedrooms, the woven runners on the corridors and the staircases. The total textile content of the house, between bed hangings and curtains and upholstery and carpets and tapestries, represents another substantial capital investment that successive generations have steadily increased. The furniture itself is the slow accumulation of 3 generations of buying. The principal pieces are the great mahogany dining table that seats 30 when fully extended, the 4 enormous mahogany sideboards that flank it, the long line of mahogany dining chairs in the Sheraton style that the present baronet's father bought in 1788. The drawing-room furniture is the Regency suite I described, in the rosewood and mahogany of the present period. Library furniture is the heavier mahogany of the 1750s and 1760s. The bedrooms contain the various beds and wardrobes and dressing tables of the various periods, with the older 18th century pieces in some rooms and the newer Regency pieces in the rooms that have been most recently redecorated. There are the various small inlaid tables, the pier tables between the windows, the small writing desks, the little card tables that fold open for evening play, the music stands, the fire screens, the work tables, the small tea caddies in their inlaid cases, the various small specialized pieces of furniture that a great country house accumulates across the decades. There are, scattered through the rooms, the small accumulated objects that the family has been buying, the bronzes that the second baronet brought back from Italy, the small marble busts on their pedestals, the Chinese export porcelain on the mantels, the Indian shawls draped on the backs of the sofas, the Italian inlaid boxes on the side tables, the small German clocks in their elaborate cases, the small French snuff boxes in the small glass-topped cabinets, the small ivory carvings that someone in the family had been collecting around 1780. The whole accumulation, when one walks through the house and takes notice of it, is the small, steady physical record of 3 generations of country gentry life lived at the higher end of the comfortable scale. The family is not, by the standards of the great ducal houses, particularly rich. The estate brings in something close to £9,000 a year in net rents, which is a substantial income for a baronet of comfortable standing, but which is a fraction of the income of the great Whig magnates who own 20,000 or 30,000 or 50,000 acres. The accumulated wealth of the house, however, is the wealth that 90 years of careful living within a substantial income produces, with each generation adding its own contributions to the pictures and the books and the silver and the porcelain and the linen, with the small, steady stock of household objects deepening across the decades into the substantial physical inheritance that the present family enjoys. The coziness of the house is, in considerable part, the coziness produced by all of this accumulation. The richness of the textures around you, on every side, in every room, in every cabinet and cupboard and chest, produces a particular quality of physical environment that is very specific to country house living. You sit on a chair, upholstered in silk that someone in the family chose with care 50 years ago. You eat off a plate that was made to a special pattern for the house 35 years ago. You drink from a glass that came from a set that someone in the family bought when she was a young bride 40 years ago. You sleep between sheets that have been laundered 100 times in the small, careful weekly routine of the laundry maids. You walk on a carpet that has been brushed every morning by a housemaid for the past 25 years. You read by candles that come from a chandler's shop in the local market town that the family has been using since the second baronet's time. You warm yourself at a fire built up by a footman who learned the building of fires from a senior footman who had himself learned a generation earlier. Every small detail of the physical environment around you has been thought about, chosen, paid for, maintained, polished, brushed, laundered, repaired, replaced, by someone in the household across the small, steady decades that the household has been running. This is what the cosy richness of a country house actually was. Not opulence in the showy sense, although there were elements of showiness in the great staterooms that were laid out for visitors, not luxury in the modern sense of self-indulgent consumption, but the slow, steady, deep accumulation of substantial wealth turned into the daily texture of a particular kind of life. The fires lit, the candles burning, the pictures on the walls, the silver on the table, the linen on the bed, the wine in the decanter, the food on the plate, the carpet on the floor, the tapestry in the corridor, the book in your hand. Everywhere you turn, in a great country house in 1817, you encounter the small physical accumulation of 3 generations of substantial living. The wealth is not displayed. The wealth is simply present. The staff who maintain all of this are the invisible engine that the cozy richness depends on. I want, before I move on, to give you a clearer picture of who the household staff actually are, because the staff are not a vague mass, but a small structured community of specific people with specific responsibilities. And the small pleasure of country house living depends at every step on their work. The senior staff of the house are organized into a strict hierarchy. The butler is the head of the male side of the indoor staff. He is a man of about 50 who has been in the family service for over 25 years, having come to the house as an under-butler in his late 20s and having risen to the senior position when his predecessor retired in 1808. He is a tall, thin, grave man in the dark-coloured coat that butlers wore for their working hours, with the small bunch of keys at his waist that mark his authority over the wine cellar and the strong room and the various other locked storage areas of the house. He directs the male servants. He manages the dining room service. He is, in his own small, careful way, the principal manager of the daily public-facing operations of the establishment. The housekeeper is his counterpart on the female side. She is a woman of about 45 who has been in the family's service for nearly 15 years. She is a tall, comfortable woman in the black dress and the small white cap that housekeepers wore, with her own bunch of keys at her waist. She directs the female servants. She manages the linen room and the still room and the storerooms. She conducts the daily inventory of the household. She is responsible, with the cook, for the planning of the meals and the management of the household stores. The cook is a woman of about 38, the daughter of a country cook who had been in service in another county and who had trained her daughter in the family kitchen from the age of 10. She came to the house as kitchen maid in 1804 and rose to be cook in 1812 when her predecessor retired. She is competent at the country house cooking of the period, with a particular gift for the elaborate game pies and the soft, delicate dessert puddings that the period valued. She manages the kitchen staff of 4 undercooks and kitchen maids. She works in the great vaulted kitchen in the basement, with its 2 enormous fireplaces and its long rows of copper pans and its iron range that the family had installed in 1811. The valet of the baronet is a man of about 35 who has been with the baronet for 12 years. He looks after the baronet's clothes, brushes his coats, dresses his hair, polishes his boots, manages his small daily personal needs. The lady's maid of the present lady of the house is a French woman in her late 30s who has been with her for the past 8 years and who came over from France during the brief peace of 1802. She manages Lady Lacy's clothes, dresses her hair, attends to her small daily needs, and serves as her confidant in many of the small matters that ladies' maids have always known about their mistresses. Below these senior figures come the under-servants in their various ranks, the under-butler, the senior footman, 2 junior footmen, a page boy, a steward's room boy who carries messages between the upper servants, the senior housemaid, 3 under-housemaids, 2 laundry maids, a still-room maid, a dairy maid, the kitchen staff under the cook, the various small specialized servants, the lamp boy, the boot boy, the knife boy who keeps the kitchen knives sharp. All of these people, in their various ranks and functions, perform the small daily work that produces the daily life of the family. The fires you sit by have been lit by a housemaid. The food you eat has been prepared by the cook and her staff. The wine you drink has been brought up from the cellar by the butler. The bed you will sleep in has been made up by a housemaid and warmed by Mary. The candles that light the rooms have been trimmed by the lamp boy. The boots that have been left outside your door overnight will be cleaned by the boot boy before morning. The small daily comfort of country house living rests at every step on the small daily work of the staff, and the household runs because each of these people performs their small specific function with the regularity that 90 years of established routine have produced. And the cozy richness, then, is not a single quality. It is the slow accumulation of 3 generations of beautiful objects in a house of remarkable scale, maintained by a small army of specialized staff, all working together to produce, for the small handful of inhabitants and their occasional guests, the daily texture of a particular kind of life. The pictures on the walls, the books on the shelves, the silver in the strong room, the linen in the press, the wine in the cellar, the food in the larders, the fires in the grates, the candles on the mantels, the flowers in the vases, the horses in the stables, the gardeners in the gardens, the servants in their proper places at their proper hours, the slow, steady, invisible work that produces the cozy richness, all happening around you all the time, with you at the small lit center of it, the recipient of all this care. It is, when you stop to think about it, a remarkable thing to be inside. The current owner is a baronet, the fourth of his family to hold the title since it was created for his great-grandfather in 1715. He is a man in his late 50s, of moderate political opinions tending Whig but not aggressively so, of comfortable but not enormous fortune, of regular church attendance, of moderate education, of considerable practical knowledge of agriculture and estate management, of slightly more than moderate weight, and of generally cheerful disposition. He has been a member of Parliament for the county for the past 20 years, in the family seat that his father held before him, and he attends Parliament for the parts of the year when it is sitting, although he does not speak in debates, and is generally regarded by his colleagues as a reliable but unremarkable backbencher. His wife, the present lady of the house, is a woman of similar age and similar disposition, the daughter of a neighbouring landowner, married to him for 33 years, the mother of 7 children, of whom 5 are still living. Their 2 surviving sons are both married and established in their own lives, the elder being a country gentleman in his own right at his wife's family seat in the next county, the younger being in the army. Their 3 surviving daughters are all married. The house, therefore, contains tonight only the baronet and his wife, and a small house party of guests, of which you are one, with the various servants of the establishment and 1 or 2 visiting relations who come and go. The small house party that the baronet and his lady are hosting this autumn includes, in addition to yourself, 4 other guests. There is the rector of the parish, who is not strictly a guest in the sense of staying in the house, but who has been dining with the family every other evening since you arrived, and who is a permanent fixture in the social life of the estate. There is a widowed cousin of the baronet's wife, a Mrs. Lacey, a woman in her 60s who has been living quietly with the family for some weeks, and who will go on to her son's house in November. There is a younger man, a Mr. Henley, who is the son of a friend of the baronet's from his Oxford days, on his way back to Oxford after a summer in the north, and stopping for a fortnight at the baronet's invitation. There is a young woman, a Miss York, who is the niece of the baronet's wife, staying for an extended autumn visit, while her own family's house is being repaired after a small fire that damaged the east wing in July. And there is you. The exact reason for your presence in the house is not the point of tonight's listening, and I will leave it slightly vague, but you are connected to the family in some way that has produced this invitation, and you have been comfortable since you arrived, and the family has received you with the warmth that English country houses generally extended to guests who fitted in. You arrived 3 days ago. You came in the family carriage which had been sent to meet you at the inn at the local market town where the post-chaise from London had set you down. The drive from the market town to the house had been about 7 miles, on the country lanes that wound between the fields and through the small villages that the estate's tenants farmed. You had passed, on the way, the parish church just outside the park gates, a small Norman building with a 15th century tower and a churchyard full of weather-darkened headstones. You had passed through the park gates, where the gatekeeper had come out of his lodge to take off his hat to the carriage. You had driven up the long avenue of beech trees that the second baronet had planted in 1748, with the leaves now turning to the small first golds and rusts of the late September. You had crossed the small stone bridge that Capability Brown had built over the stream that fed the lake. You had emerged from the avenue into the open park, with the house suddenly visible across the grass to the east, looking exactly the way an English country house was meant to look when it was first seen from the approach, rising out of its setting like something that had grown there, with the long horizontal of the main block balanced by the projecting wings, with the pale stone catching the September afternoon light, with the smoke from a dozen chimneys drifting up into the soft air. You had been received at the door by the family. The baronet had come out himself, in the slightly old-fashioned country way that meant the host actually came to the door rather than letting the butler manage the reception. His lady had been at his side. The greetings had been warm and unforced. Your luggage had been taken by 2 footmen up to the bedroom that had been prepared for you. You had been shown briefly through the principal rooms of the ground floor by your host before being taken up to your room to change after the journey. Tea had been served that first afternoon in the smaller of the 2 drawing rooms on the first floor at 5 o'clock. You had taken your first dinner with the family that night. You had retired to bed at 11. The next 2 days had passed in the slow, comfortable rhythm of an English country house in late September. You had walked in the gardens. You had ridden out on one of the horses the baronet had put at your disposal with Mr. Henley and Miss York. You had taken a long walk down to the lake and around it and back. You had sat in the library and read. You had written letters. You had taken your meals with the family. You had made small, slow conversation with the rector when he had come up from the parsonage for dinner. You had begun to know the household. You had begun to feel the small interior settling that comes when one has been in a comfortable house for several days and has stopped being a stranger to it. This evening, the 4th evening of your stay, is the evening I want to walk you through. There is no special occasion tonight. There is no expected drama. There is only the steady, slow texture of an autumn evening in a country house, with the candles being lit as the light fails and the fires being built up against the cool of the September night, and the household moving through its familiar rhythms toward the dinner that will be the centre of the evening, and the long, slow drawing-room evening after dinner, and the candles being put out one by one as the family and their guests go up to bed in the quiet, small hours of the night. Let me start with where you are, right now, in the late afternoon of this 4th day, before the evening has properly begun. You are in your bedroom on the first floor of the south wing of the house. The room was given to you on your arrival because it is the principal guest bedroom on this floor, the room generally used for the more important visitors to the house, and your relationship to the family has been judged to merit it. The room is large by the standards of the period, about 24 feet long and 18 feet wide, with a high coved ceiling decorated with a small painted oval of clouds and cherubs from the 1760s redecoration. The walls are hung with a pale green silk damask that was put up about 20 years ago and that has faded in places where the light from the windows falls on it most directly. The floor is wide oak planking covered in the centre of the room with a Turkish carpet of deep reds and blues. The fireplace is on the inside wall, of pale grey marble with classical figures carved at the corners of the mantel. The bed is a 4-poster with crimson hangings of a heavier material than the wall silk, set against the wall opposite the fireplace, with 2 small steps to climb up onto it, because the mattress is high and the bed is built for the older fashion of being well above the floor. There is a small writing desk near the window. There is a dressing table with a large oval looking-glass mounted above it. There is a wardrobe of figured walnut against the east wall. There is a small fireplace chair drawn up close to the grate. There are 2 large windows in the south wall looking out over the lower garden and the park beyond. The fire in the grate has been lit perhaps 20 minutes ago by one of the housemaids who came up while you were still downstairs and built it up from the embers that had been kept alive through the day. The fire is now burning steadily, the small new logs that were placed on top beginning to catch, the iron grate radiating its slow warmth out into the room. The room itself is not yet warm in the deep way it will be by the time you come up to bed, but it is warm enough now to be comfortable, and the small pleasant sound of the fire crackling is the principal sound in the room. The candles around the room have just been lit. The housemaid lit them, in fact, before she left, in the small ritual of the late afternoon that the household performs each day at this hour. There are 2 on the mantel, in silver candlesticks. There are 2 more on the dressing table, 1 on either side of the looking glass. There is 1 on the writing desk. There is 1 on the small table beside the bed. The candles are of fine beeswax, the kind that the family uses in the principal rooms, with the slight clean smell of beeswax burning that is one of the small distinctive smells of an 18th century country house in the evening. The light they throw is not bright. It is the soft gold light of perhaps a dozen candles distributed around a large room, with the corners of the room remaining in dimness and the central area in a comfortable warm glow. Through the windows, the September afternoon has been slowly turning into the September evening. The light when you came up to your room was the soft late afternoon light of about 5:30. It is now nearer 6, and the light has been changing across the past half hour into the slightly dimmer, slightly bluer light. That means the sun is somewhere behind the trees of the western boundary of the park. You have not closed the curtains yet. You have been sitting in the small chair by the fire for the past few minutes, doing nothing in particular, just letting the day end and the evening begin. The day has been a pleasant one. You woke at 8, when the housemaid came in to light the fire and to leave the small jug of hot water on the washstand. You drank the cup of chocolate that came up at 8:30 on the small tray that Mary, your maid for the duration of your stay, brought up. You read for 10 minutes while the chocolate cooled. You rose, washed, dressed, and went down to breakfast at 9:30. The breakfast, in the small breakfast room on the ground floor of the south wing, was the unhurried country breakfast that the family kept up: tea, coffee, chocolate, fresh rolls, butter, jam from the kitchen garden's summer fruit, a dish of cold ham, a dish of poached eggs, a dish of grilled mushrooms from the home farm. You ate slowly, in conversation with Mr. Henley and Miss York, both of whom had come down before you and were finishing their own breakfasts. The baronet had not come down yet. His lady had taken her breakfast in her own apartments, as she generally did. The rector, who had come up from the parsonage to discuss a small matter of estate business with the baronet, was in the library waiting. You had seen him through the door as you passed. He had nodded to you. You had nodded back. After breakfast, at about 10, you went out into the gardens. The morning had been clear, with a small autumn freshness in the air, and you had wanted to walk before the day's other activities began. You had gone out through the door at the south end of the entrance hall, which led directly onto the small gravel terrace that ran along the south front of the house. From the terrace, 3 shallow stone steps led down onto the lawn, which sloped away gently for perhaps 200 yards before flattening out into the wider park. You had walked across the lawn, with the dew still wet in patches where the sun had not yet reached, and had headed east along the small gravel path that led around the east end of the house to the formal flower garden that the second baronet's wife had laid out in the 1750s, and that the present lady of the house had been carefully maintaining since her marriage 33 years ago. The flower garden, in late September, was at the slightly worn end of its season. The summer flowers were largely gone. The dahlias were still in bloom in the deep beds along the south wall, in the dark reds and oranges and yellows that the late summer produced. The roses were mostly past, with only a few late blooms still hanging on the climbing varieties on the trellises. The herbaceous borders were full of asters and Michaelmas daisies, in the soft purples and pale pinks that the autumn produced. The whole garden had the slightly tired, slightly faded look of a flower garden in the last weeks of its year, but the walks were freshly raked. The small box hedges had been clipped that week by the gardener's apprentice, and the whole effect was of a place that had been carefully kept all summer and was now being eased into its winter quiet. You walked through the flower garden slowly. You stopped to look at the dahlias for a few minutes. You went on, through the small gate at the east end of the garden, into the kitchen garden beyond. The kitchen garden was a large walled rectangle of perhaps 3 acres, with high brick walls on all 4 sides. The south wall lined with the espaliered fruit trees that produced the family's apricots and peaches, the north wall providing the cold shelter that the salad crops preferred. The garden was, in late September, in the busy middle of its autumn work. The gardener and his 2 apprentices were at the far end, harvesting the last of the summer's beans. The pumpkins were ripening on the vine in the bed nearest the central path. The autumn cabbages were standing in their long rows. The herb garden in the small enclosed corner was at its untidy late summer profusion, with the lavender bushes overgrown and the mint and thyme spilling out of their small beds. You walked through the kitchen garden along the central path, exchanging a small civil greeting with the gardener, and exited at the far end through the small wooden door that opened onto the back drive. From the back drive, you could see the stable yard about 50 yards away to your left, with the long, low buildings that housed the family's 12 horses, the carriages, the harness room, the groom's quarters, and the small forge where the resident farrier did the daily work of keeping the horses shod. The stable yard, like the kitchen garden, was busy at this hour. 2 of the undergrooms were exercising horses in the small training paddock. The head coachman was in conversation with the farrier near the forge. A small boy of about 11, the son of one of the tenants, who was earning his keep around the stables in the hope of eventually being taken on as a stable boy, was carrying water from the pump to one of the troughs. You did not this morning go into the stable yard. You turned instead to your right and followed the back drive around the east end of the house, past the chapel and the small graveyard where the previous baronets and their families were buried, and came out on the north side of the house where the home farm was visible across the fields. The home farm was the agricultural heart of the estate, the working farm that supplied the household with most of its food and the surrounding countryside with the rest. You had visited it the previous afternoon with the baronet and Mr. Henley, who had wanted to see the new threshing machine that the baronet had bought in the spring, and that was being demonstrated by the bailiff. You did not go to the home farm this morning. You stood for a few minutes on the path looking at it across the fields, with the small group of buildings visible in the distance, and the smoke rising from the chimney of the bailiff's house, and then you turned back toward the house. You came back through the small east garden door and went up to the library, where you spent the next hour and a half writing letters. You had 3 letters to write. You had put them off the previous day because you had been busy with other things, and you wanted to clear them this morning before the rest of the day's activities began. The library, at this hour of a quiet country morning, was one of the most pleasant rooms you had ever sat in. It ran along the entire east side of the library wing, about 60 feet long and 22 feet wide, with 5 large windows on the south side overlooking the gardens, and the long opposite wall-lined floor-to-ceiling with the bookshelves that the 3rd baronet had installed in the 1750s. The books filled the shelves entirely, in the slightly random arrangement that family libraries fall into across generations of editions, with the older calf-bound volumes on the lower shelves and the more recent acquisitions on the upper shelves. The middle of the room was furnished with several large reading tables, a number of comfortable chairs and sofas, and a long writing desk near the central window where the family's regular correspondence was conducted. You took your usual chair at the writing desk, dipped the pen, and worked steadily through the 3 letters. The first letter was a polite letter to your hostess's elder sister, who lived in another county, and who had asked you on a previous occasion to send her a small piece of news from this house when you next visited. You did so. You wrote a careful account of the small social texture of the family at present, of the visiting guests, of the health of the baronet and his lady, of the small piece of news about the elder son's wife being expected in the spring of a 5th child. The letter was about 3 pages. The second letter was to a friend in London who had been ill in the late summer, and from whom you had recently had a letter giving an account of her recovery. You wrote with the warmth that the letter required, expressing your relief at her recovery, asking after several mutual acquaintances, mentioning a small piece of news that you thought would amuse her about a wedding that was about to take place in your circle. The letter was about 4 pages. The third letter was to your own family in the regular weekly correspondence that you maintained with them when you were away from home. You wrote a careful account of your stay at this house, of the people you had met, of the activities of your days, of your general state of mind and health. The letter was about 5 pages. It took you the longest of the 3 because the family wanted detail, and you knew that detail was what would please them. By 11:30, you had finished all 3 letters. You had blotted them, with the small ivory-handled blotter from the writing desk drawer, pressing the soft linen blotting paper carefully across the still wet ink. You had read each one through once for the small last corrections and the small last assurances that you had said what you meant to say. You had folded each letter carefully, in the manner that the period required, with the addressee's name visible on the outer fold and the small white surface left clear for the seal. You had taken out, from the small leather travelling case that you carried with you, the small block of red sealing wax and the small candle stub that was kept for sealing letters. You had lit the candle from the fire on the hearth. You had melted the small drop of wax onto the letter. You had pressed the small silver seal that you carried, with your own small monogram engraved on it, into the wax while it was still soft. You had held the seal until the wax had cooled, in the small, careful way that the seal needed to be applied to produce a clear impression. You had blown out the candle. You had repeated the process for the 2nd and 3rd letters, with the small steady ritual of country house letter writing in 1817 carrying you through the small pleasant final stage of the morning's correspondence. You had left the 3 sealed letters in the small basket on the desk where the day's outgoing letters were collected by the footman who took them down to the village post office at noon each day. The post boy from the village would carry them on horseback to the market town later that afternoon, where they would catch the evening mail coach to London, and where, with luck, they would be in the hands of their addressees within 2 or 3 days. You had put away the writing implements, the steel pen back into its small case, the inkwell capped and returned to the desk drawer, the wax and seal back into the leather case, the candle stub returned to its small holder. You had risen from the desk. The library was by this point no longer empty. The baronet had come in at about 11, in the morning rounds he was making after his interview with the rector, and had taken a chair near the south window with the morning paper that had come up from London the previous evening. The rector had gone home. Mr. Henley had come into the library shortly after, with a book he had wanted to consult about a piece of natural history he and Miss York had been discussing the previous day. He had found the volume he wanted, and was sitting at one of the reading tables looking through it. The fire in the library grate was burning steadily. The room had the quiet, pleasant atmosphere of an English country house library on a weekday morning, with the gentlemen of the house pursuing their various small occupations in the same room without disturbing each other. You went out of the library at about 11:45. You went down to the morning room, where you found Lady Lacy, your hostess, sitting with her widowed cousin, Mrs. Lacy, both of them at their needlework. The morning room was a smaller and more comfortable room than the great drawing room, with a smaller fireplace and lower ceilings, and the slightly more domestic feeling of a room that the women of the household actually used, as opposed to the great drawing room, which was used principally for evenings and for large parties. The walls were hung with a pale yellow silk that had been put up about 15 years ago. The furniture was a comfortable mixture of older mahogany pieces and a few newer Regency-style chairs in the same pale lemon-yellow upholstery. The fire in the grate was a small, steady fire, suitable for the morning rather than the larger evening fires of the great drawing-room. The room had 3 south-facing windows looking over the same lawn that the great drawing-room above it overlooked, with the soft, late morning light coming in through the open shutters and falling across the pale yellow walls and the polished wooden floors, and the small Persian rug in the centre of the room. Lady Lacy was sitting in her usual chair by the south window, with the small upright posture of a country gentlewoman in her late 50s working at a piece of fine work. Her own work today was a piece of canvas embroidery that she had been working on for nearly 2 years, a large floral panel intended for a footstool that she was making for her elder daughter's eldest girl as a Christmas present. The piece was nearly completed. The colours of the worked silks against the cream canvas were the soft pinks and pale greens and pale golds of an English flower garden in summer, with the small stylized roses and small stylized forget-me-nots and small stylized lilies of the valley distributed across the pattern in the small, careful, symmetrical arrangement that the period favoured. She was working at this hour on the small detail at one of the corners. The small movements of her hand drawing the needle through the canvas were the slow, steady movements of someone who had been doing this work for 40 years and who had reached the kind of quiet familiarity with it that produced a deep, small interior. Calm. Mrs. Lacy, on the sofa opposite the window, was working at a smaller piece, a piece of plain white linen that she was hemming for her son's household in Hampshire, in the small, steady way of a widowed cousin who liked to feel useful and who did her share of the household linen making across her various visits. Her work was less elaborate than Lady Lacy's, but no less practiced, and the small, steady stitching was the small, steady occupation that kept her hands busy across the long mornings of her visits. You took the chair near the third window. You picked up your own work, which was a small piece of embroidery that you had been carrying around with you all summer, and that was nearing completion. The piece was a small panel in the same general style as Lady Lacy's, but smaller and simpler, intended as a small gift for an aunt of yours whose birthday was approaching. You had been working on it slowly across the past 4 months, and had reached the small final stage where most of the work was done, and only the last few small details remained. You took up the needle, threaded it with the small skein of pale rose silk that you had been using for the most recent sections, and began to work. The 3 of you sat for the next hour and a half in the slow, steady rhythm of country housewomen working at their needlework on a quiet autumn morning. The conversation between the 3 of you was the small, slow, unforced conversation that this kind of work produced. The conversation moved easily, with long, comfortable silences between the small stretches of talk, and with the talk itself arising naturally from the small things that one of you had thought about while working at the same small stitch for 10 minutes, and that you wanted to share with the others. Lady Lacy told a small story about the granddaughter for whom she was making the footstool. Mrs. Lacy contributed an observation about the price of fine cambric, which had risen since the war ended, and which she had been remarking on at her son's house in the spring. You contributed a small observation about a piece of embroidery you had seen on a visit earlier in the summer that had stayed in your mind. The conversation moved on. The needles moved. The fire crackled gently in the grate. The autumn light came in through the south windows. The clock on the mantel ticked slowly through the morning. The morning passed into noon. Lunch at this house was a small informal affair served at about 2 in the small breakfast room rather than the dining room. The baronet preferred to have his lunch at home rather than at the home farm or in the village, even on busy days, because his lady wanted his company at the lunch table when she could have it. The lunch consisted today of a cold game pie that the kitchen had prepared the previous day, a dish of cold ham, a salad of the late summer greens from the kitchen garden, fresh bread, butter, cheese, and a jug of small ale for those who wanted it, and a jug of barley water for those who did not. The party at lunch was the baronet, his lady, Mrs. Lacy, Miss York, Mr. Henley, and you. The conversation was unhurried and pleasant. The baronet told a small story about a tenant who had come to him that morning with a complaint about his neighbour's cattle straying onto his fields, which the baronet had managed to diffuse by promising to speak to the neighbour the next day. Mr. Henley asked the baronet a question about a piece of agricultural practice that he had observed at the home farm the previous afternoon, which the baronet answered with the patient detail of a man who liked talking about agriculture. Miss York and Mrs. Lacey discussed a small piece of news from the next county that had arrived that morning in a letter to Lady Lacey. The lunch lasted about an hour. After lunch, at about 3, the small house party dispersed for the afternoon. The baronet went out with Mr. Henley to inspect a piece of wall that had been damaged by a falling tree on the boundary of the park. Lady Lacey and Mrs. Lacey went up to Lady Lacey's apartments to lie down for an hour, as both of them generally did after lunch. Miss York went up to her own room to change into a riding habit, having arranged with one of the undergrooms to ride out for an hour or so before tea. You went down to the lake. The lake was about 1/4 of a mile from the south front of the house, set in a small valley that Capability Brown had deepened slightly when he had created the lake in the 1770s. The path to the lake led down across the lawn, through a small grove of oaks that had been planted as part of Brown's design, and emerged onto the bank of the lake at the point where the small Doric temple stood at the far end. The lake itself was perhaps 8 acres in surface, irregular in shape, with a small island near the western shore that was planted with willows. The bank around it was lined with low rushes and sedges. The water, on a still afternoon, reflected the trees and the sky with the slightly green tinge that English ornamental lakes produced. You walked down to the lake slowly, savouring the small autumn freshness in the air. The lawn after lunch was still slightly damp from the morning's dew, where the sun had not reached. Your shoes pressed small, slow prints in the grass behind you, which would smooth themselves out in another half hour as the grass recovered. The path, when you reached it on the far side of the lawn, was of the small, soft, pale gravel that the gardener had been keeping raked since you arrived, and your steps made small, steady, crunching sounds on the surface as you walked. You passed under the first of the oaks. The light, coming through the half-turned leaves, fell in small dappled pools on the path ahead of you. The leaves on the oaks had begun to turn. The ones at the top of the canopy, where the most direct sun fell, were already in the small first golds and rusts of the autumn change. The ones further down, in the shade, were still mostly green, with only the small first blushes of yellow at the edges. You stopped, briefly, to look up into the canopy of one of the larger trees. The light through the leaves was the soft late afternoon light of a clear September day, and the slow, small movements of the leaves in the small breeze made the light shift on your face in the small irregular way that the light through autumn leaves always shifts. You walked on. The path curved gently down toward the lake, in the small designed way that Capability Brown had laid it out, with the lake remaining hidden until the very last turn, so that the view of the water came as a small surprise after the descent through the trees. The small autumn wildflowers along the path had mostly gone. The summer wildflowers, the cornflowers and the foxgloves and the wild roses that had filled the path in July were entirely past. What remained were the late asters in their soft pale purple, and the small white flowers of yarrow that grew everywhere along the edge of the path, and the occasional small late head of campion. A single small white butterfly, late in the season for butterflies, drifted across the path in front of you and disappeared into the long grass on the other side. You came out from under the oaks and saw the lake. The lake, in the slightly dimming light of late afternoon, was the dark green-blue colour of still water under a clear autumn sky. The surface was almost entirely still. A very small breeze, just at the edge of perceptibility, was producing the smallest possible ripples in the water near the eastern shore, where it touched the rushes, but the centre of the lake was glass smooth, and the reflection of the trees on the far bank was as clear and detailed as the trees themselves. A heron rose from the lake as you approached, the slow, heavy beating of its wings carrying it away across the water toward the further bank. It alighted in the deliberate folding way of herons in the long grass at the edge of the small inlet at the far end. A pair of moorhens were working their way along the rushes near the small landing stage where the family's rowing boat was tied up. A small sandy-coloured dog, The spaniel that the baronet kept and that ran more or less freely around the estate was visible at the far end near the temple, sniffing along the shore with its tail in steady motion. You walked round the lake by the path, which took perhaps 30 minutes. The path on the western side ran along the open bank, with the lake to your right and the open park to your left. The path on the eastern side ran through a small belt of trees that Brown had planted to give the eastern shore a more enclosed feeling. You went past the small Doric temple at the far end, which had been built in the 1770s as a small folly to mark the end of the lake, and which was a delicate little classical building of pale stone with 4 columns supporting a small pediment and a small open chamber inside that contained a stone bench. The temple was, in its way, one of the most charming things in the park. It had been designed by a London architect of moderate reputation in 1772, in the prevailing classical taste of the period, with 4 Doric columns at the front and a small pediment with a small carved garland in the centre. The building was open at the front, with the columns merely supporting the entablature and the pediment, and the small interior chamber was visible from the path. You stepped, briefly, into the chamber. The stone bench was set against the back wall. You sat on it for a few minutes. The temple, when you sat in it, framed a particular view. The 4 columns at the front made a kind of frame around the view of the lake and the trees and the far end of the park, with the house itself just visible in the very far distance through a gap that Brown had carefully designed in the planting. The view was the principal point of the temple, and Brown had laid out the planting around the lake specifically to produce this view, with the various clumps of trees positioned to give the eye exactly the kind of pastoral landscape composition that the period understood as ideal. Sitting on the stone bench inside the temple, with the columns making their slim vertical lines on either side of the view, the lake stretching away toward the house, the trees making their soft dark masses on either side of the water, and the small distant pale shape of the house at the very end of the view, you could see what the 3rd baronet had been trying to create when he had brought Brown in. He had been trying to produce, on his own land, a version of the pastoral landscape that the educated taste of the 18th century had identified through the paintings of Claude and Poussin and the Italian Campagna and the writings of various 18th century theorists as the most beautiful kind of country there was. He had succeeded. The view from the temple, on a quiet autumn afternoon in 1817, was one of the more beautiful views in England, and you sat on the bench for several minutes, simply looking at it. You stood up. You walked out of the temple. You continued around the lake. You came around the western bank, past the willows on the small island, and emerged back near the path that led up to the house, which you took, walking slowly back across the lawn, with the house gradually rising in front of you in the soft afternoon light. By 4 o'clock you were back in the house. You went up to your room. You changed out of your morning dress, which had got slightly muddy at the hem from the lake walk, and into the afternoon dress that Mary had laid out for you. You sat in your room for about 20 minutes, with the small late afternoon light coming in through the south windows, doing nothing in particular. You read a few pages of a book that you had brought with you to the room. You stood at the window for a few minutes looking out across the park. You thought briefly about a small piece of family business that was waiting for your attention when you returned home, but you put it out of your mind because you were on a country visit, and the point of a country visit was to put such things out of your mind for a while. At 4:30 you went down to the smaller drawing room for tea. Tea, at this house and at this period, was not the elaborate ceremony it would become in the Victorian era. It was a small informal gathering at 4:30 or 5, where the family and their guests came together for an hour or so before dressing for dinner. There were small cakes, slices of bread and butter, biscuits. There was the tea itself, served from a silver teapot that Lady Lacy kept locked in a small caddy in the corner cupboard, made with the leaves she had measured out carefully because the tea was expensive, and she ran her household with the careful frugality of an Englishwoman of her class. There were perhaps half a dozen cups of tea served per person across the hour. The atmosphere was the small, pleasant, social atmosphere of a country house tea on an autumn afternoon. The party at tea today was the same as it had been at lunch, with the addition of the rector, who had come back up from the parsonage for tea before going home to dress and then returning for dinner. The conversation moved across several topics. The rector told a small story about a christening he had performed that morning. Lady Lacy described a small letter she had received from her younger daughter in Yorkshire, with news of a grandchild's first steps. Miss York, who had returned from her ride and was in slightly higher spirits than she had been at lunch, told a small comic story about an encounter in the lane with a tenant's wife who had not recognised her on her unfamiliar horse. The baronet, who had returned from his inspection of the damaged wall in slightly grumpier spirits than he had set out in, contributed a small grumble about the cost of repairing it. The whole party laughed at his grumble, and at the rector's calm assurance that the wall would still be standing when all of them were dust. Tea ended at about 5:15. The party broke up. The rector went home to dress for dinner. The baronet went to his own apartments. Lady Lacy and Mrs. Lacy went up. Miss York went up. Mr. Henley went up. You went up. And that brings us to the present moment of this listening. You are now in your bedroom on the first floor of the south wing, in the small chair by the fire, with the candles around the room burning steadily and the September evening slowly darkening through the south windows. The afternoon is gone. The day is ending. The evening is about to begin. The next stage of the evening, which will be the dressing for dinner, will take about an hour and will be conducted in the slow, careful, pleasant rhythm of evening dressing in 1795. Before Mary comes up to do the dressing, you have about 10 minutes to yourself in the room. Let me describe the room for you a little more fully, because the room is going to be the small interior space you live inside for the next part of the evening, and I want you to be able to picture it. The walls, as I said, are hung with pale green silk damask. The pattern of the damask is a small repeating one, of stylized flowers and leaves, in the slightly elaborate French manner that was fashionable when the room was redecorated in the 1770s. The silk has faded along the south wall where the sun comes in through the windows in the strongest summer light, but it is still in good condition along the other three walls, and the overall effect is of a room of pale clean colour, with the small interest of the silk pattern providing texture. The wood trim around the doors and windows is painted white, with the moulding picked out in a slightly darker grey-white that gives definition to the architectural detail. The ceiling, 12 feet above the floor, is divided by plaster ribs into a central oval and 4 corner panels. The central oval contains the small painted scene of clouds and cherubs that I mentioned, painted around 1770 by an Italian decorative painter who had worked at several other Midlands country houses in the same period. The painting is delicate, in the soft pale colours of late Rococo decoration, and it has the small charm of a ceiling painting that is not trying to be impressive, but simply trying to be pleasant. The corner panels are filled with simple plaster decoration of garlands and ribbons. The whole ceiling has been recently cleaned, in the small ongoing maintenance that an old house requires, and is in good condition. The floor is wide oak planking, polished to a soft gleam by Mary's careful weekly attention with beeswax, and covered in the centre of the room by the Turkish carpet I described. The carpet is older than the room's current decoration, having been bought by the second baronet in the 1740s on a small continental tour, and is in slightly faded deep reds and blues with the slight irregularities of a hand-knotted carpet that has been in use for 50 years. It has small worn patches near the door and near the bed, where the most foot traffic passes, but the central area is still in good condition. The fireplace on the inside wall is the focal point of the room. It is of pale grey-white marble, with the classical figures I mentioned carved at the corners of the mantel. Small full-length figures of Apollo on the left and Diana on the right, in the conventional 18th century style, holding their respective attributes of lyre and bow. The fire grate inside the marble surround is a basket grate of the kind that came in around 1760, with iron bars curving forward to hold the coals. There is a small set of fire irons standing in a stand to the right of the grate, a poker, a pair of tongs, a small brush, and a small shovel. There is a coal scuttle of polished brass next to the stand. The fire is now burning well, with the small new logs catching properly on top of the coals, and the warmth from the grate is now noticeable across the whole room. Above the mantel hangs a small oil painting in a gilt frame of a landscape in the Italian manner, painted by a follower of Claude Lorraine in the 1730s. The painting shows a classical landscape with a small temple, a winding river, and figures in classical dress in the foreground. It was bought by the 3rd Baronet on his own grand tour in the 1740s. It has been hanging in this room since the room was redecorated in the 1770s. You have been looking at it, on and off, since you arrived 3 days ago, and you have been thinking each time you look at it that it is not a particularly distinguished painting, but that it is a particularly pleasant one to live with, which is in many ways a more useful quality in a painting than distinction. The bed against the wall opposite the fireplace is the largest piece of furniture in the room. It is a 4-poster of carved mahogany made in the 1770s by a London cabinet maker, with the slightly slimmer and lighter proportions of late Georgian bed-making compared with the heavier earlier types. The 4 posts rise about 8 feet from the floor, with carved capitals at the top supporting the canopy. The canopy itself is a wooden frame from which the bed hangings depend. The hangings are of the crimson wool damask I mentioned, lined with a fine cream linen, and they can be drawn closed all the way around the bed at night for warmth. Although the bed curtains in country houses of this period were generally only fully closed in the coldest part of winter, and tonight, like every other night since you arrived, you will leave them partly open. The mattress is high. It is built up of a straw underlay, a wool middle layer, and a feather-top mattress, with the whole assembly making the bed nearly 4 feet from the floor at the level of the surface. There are 2 small carved wooden steps at the side of the bed by which one climbs up onto it. The bed is made up, at this hour in its day arrangement, with the heavy crimson cover smoothed neatly across the surface and the pillows arranged at the head. Mary will turn it down later, when you are dressing for dinner, in the small ritual of preparing the bed for the night. The 2 windows in the south wall are tall sash windows of the early Georgian style, with 12 small panes of glass in each sash, set in a fine moulded frame painted white. The curtains are of the same pale green silk damask as the walls, but heavier and lined with a cream cotton for warmth. They were drawn back at the moment, held by the small silk tassels that hang from the silver-plated tiebacks fixed into the wall. Beyond the windows, the September evening is now well advanced, with the light having faded across the past half hour into the slightly bluer dusk that means the sun is now fully below the trees of the western boundary. You can see through the windows the lower garden in the foreground, the lawn sweeping away beyond it, the dim shape of the small grove of oaks halfway down to the lake, and beyond that, the dimmer shape of the trees of the park boundary against the eastern sky, which is now beginning to show its first small high stars. The dressing table, in the corner between the south wall and the east wall, is a small mahogany table on tapering legs, with a marble top and a silver-mounted dressing service laid out across it. The service includes a small mirror on a stand, a pair of silver candlesticks, a silver brush set, a silver hand mirror, several small jars of the various creams and powders you use for your evening toilette, a small cut-glass scent bottle, a small silver pin tray, and the small leather case that contains the few pieces of jewellery you have brought with you for the visit. The looking-glass on the wall above the dressing table is large and oval, in a carved and gilded frame, with a slightly mottled silvering of a glass that is now about 50 years old. The wardrobe against the east wall is the figured walnut piece I mentioned, of the broad, heavy type that English country houses had been making since the 1740s. It contains your travelling clothes for the visit, hanging on the hooks inside its single tall door, with the small drawers below containing the smaller items of dress that do not need hanging. Mary has been managing the contents of the wardrobe across the past 3 days, brushing out the dresses you have worn, hanging them carefully, taking the morning dress you wore today out for cleaning, where it had got muddy at the hem. The small writing desk near the window is a portable mahogany desk of the kind that travellers often took with them on country visits, although this one is the desk that is generally kept in this guest room for the use of guests who want to write letters in their own room, rather than going down to the library. It contains in its small drawers a supply of paper, ink, pens, sealing wax, and a small ivory-handled letter opener. You have not used it yourself for letters, since you have preferred the library for your correspondence, but you have used it once or twice for small private notes and for the small daily journal that you have been keeping during the visit. There is a small armchair in the bay of one of the windows, and a small chaise longue against the west wall, and the small fireplace chair that you are now sitting in, drawn up close to the grate. The fireplace chair is upholstered in a deep red wool that complements the bed hangings, with carved wooden arms and small clawed feet. It is comfortable. It has the slightly worn quality of a chair that has been in this room for 30 years, and has been sat in by perhaps 100 different guests across that time, each of them, like you tonight, finding their own small temporary comfort in it. That's your room. You have been in it now, alone, for about 10 minutes since you came up from tea. The fire is burning well. The candles are burning steadily. The room is warm. You have been sitting in the chair doing nothing in particular, letting the day end and the evening begin. There is nothing you need to do in the next few minutes. Mary will come up at about 6:15 to begin the dressing for dinner, which will take about an hour. Dinner will be served at 7:30. The whole evening lies ahead of you, in its slow, comfortable, predictable rhythm, and you have nothing to do except to be here in the warm room, with the small autumn evening settling around the house outside, and the household going about its quiet preparations for the dinner. You hear faintly the clock in the entrance hall striking 6. The small distinct chimes carry up through the house in the way that the sounds of a country house carry between its rooms, a faint distant punctuation rather than an immediate sound. You know by now the various small sounds of the house at this hour. The clock striking 6. The faint distant clattering from the kitchens far below where the kitchen staff are at the busiest stage of the dinner preparation. The occasional sound of footsteps in the corridor outside your door as servants pass on their various errands. The faint sound occasionally of a door opening and closing somewhere on the floor below. The small, steady underlying sound of the great house at the end of a quiet day, with its 40-odd indoor servants going about their slow preparations for the evening, and its 8 or 10 guests retreating to their various rooms to dress, and the whole large, complicated organism of a country house establishment moving toward its principal evening event with the unforced ease of long practice. You stand up. You walk over to the south windows. You look out into the dimming dusk. The lawn in the foreground is now quite dim. The trees beyond are dim shapes against the slightly less dim sky. Few small lights are visible in the distance. In the cottages of the village beyond the park gates, where the villagers are now lighting their candles for the evening, the smoke from the chimneys of the village rises in faint, thin columns into the still autumn air. A bat flies past the window, the small dark shape moving in its irregular flight against the dim grey of the sky. The world outside is settling into its evening. You stand at the window for a few minutes, simply looking. You have been doing this each evening at this hour since you arrived, and you have been finding, each time, that the small, slow act of looking at the dimming park from the warm interior of the room has been one of the small, steady pleasures of your visit. The contrast between the inside and the outside is one of the central pleasures of country house living. The dim, cool, fading world outside, the warm, bright, comfortable world inside. The small, steady knowledge that you are well sheltered, well fed, well warmed, well attended to, in a house that has been doing exactly this for 60 years and will be doing exactly this long after you have gone. You turn from the window. You walk slowly back to the chair by the fire. You sit down. You wait for Mary. Mary, when she comes up at 6:15, taps lightly on the door before she comes in the small habit of country house personal maids who have been trained to give their mistresses a small private moment before entering. You say, "Come in." She comes in. She is a young woman of about 26, of moderate height, with the slightly thin, sharp face of a country girl who has been in service since she was 13 and has worked her way up through several country houses to the position she now occupies as one of the senior chambermaids of this establishment, with the additional responsibility of personal attendance on guests of the principal sort during their visits. She has been your maid for the past 3 days. The two of you have fallen, across the past 3 days, into the comfortable working rhythm of mistress and personal maid, with the small, steady understanding that practical women develop when they have been working together at small, careful tasks. She comes into the room with the small armful of things she has brought up from the linen room. Fresh stockings for the evening, a fresh chemise, the small pieces of underclothing that the dressing will require. She lays these out on the bed with the small, careful precision of a woman who has done this thousands of times. She glances at the fire, sees that it is burning well, glances at the candles, sees that they are the curtains, sees that they have not yet been drawn, and goes to the south windows to draw them. The heavy-lined curtains come together across the windows with the small, soft sound of silk against silk, and the room, with the curtains drawn, becomes immediately a more enclosed and more intimate space, with a small interior world of the candle-lit room now sealed off from the dimming dusk outside. She comes back. She asks you, in the small soft voice she uses for the evening dressing, whether you are ready to begin. You say you are. She begins. The dressing for dinner in 1817 in a country house of this kind is a process that takes about an hour, and that proceeds through a series of small stages, each of which has its own slow, careful rhythm. Mary, like all good country housemaids, has a particular sequence she follows, and the sequence has the quality of a small private ritual that the two of you go through together each evening at this hour. She begins by helping you out of the afternoon dress that you have been wearing since you came up from the lake walk. She unhooks the small fastenings at the back of the dress, lifts it carefully off your shoulders, draws it down over your arms, gathers it up at your feet, and lifts it away. She hangs the dress on the dressing form near the wardrobe. She glances at it, in the small assessing way of a maid who is looking to see whether the dress needs any small attention before it is put away, and decides that it does not, and moves on. She helps you out of the petticoat you have been wearing under the afternoon dress, in the same careful way. She lifts it off, folds it, sets it aside. You are now in your stays and your chemise. The stays of a Regency lady's evening dress in 1817 are the short ones that have come into fashion since the long stays of the previous century. They lift and shape the bust without constricting the waist in the older manner, and they are fastened at the back with a single line of laces that Mary now adjusts with the small, precise tightening that the evening dress will require. The dress you will be wearing tonight is a high-waisted gown in the prevailing style, which means the line of the bodice falls just under the bust, and the stays therefore need to provide the slight lift and support that the bodice will rest on. Mary makes the adjustment carefully. She asks, in the small soft voice she uses for these small queries, whether the lacing is comfortable. You say it is. She moves on. She brings the fresh chemise from the bed. She helps you out of the day chemise briefly, in the small efficient way that maids manage these small private moments without making them awkward. She helps you into the fresh evening chemise of fine white cambric with a small lace trim at the neck. She smooths it down. She adjusts the fall of the fabric over the stays. She moves on. She brings the fresh white silk stockings and ties them just above the knee with the small ribbon garters that hold them in place. She fastens them carefully. She moves on. She brings the petticoat for the evening dress, which is of a fine white muslin, lighter than the afternoon petticoat, and helps you into it. She fastens it at the waist. She smooths it down. She moves on. She brings the dress. The dress for tonight has been laid out earlier in the day, in the small ritual of dress laying that the upper maid does in the late afternoon before the personal maid begins the dressing. The dress is one of your better evening dresses, although not your best, because tonight is a small family dinner with the regular guests of the house, and not a larger occasion that would call for the most elaborate dress in your travelling wardrobe. The dress is of pale primrose yellow silk, with a small white lace trim at the bodice and the short puffed sleeves, and a band of small embroidered flowers around the high waistline. The skirt falls in the long straight line that the Regency style required, with the small slight train at the back that was the fashionable touch in evening dresses of this season. It is the kind of dress that a young woman of fashion would wear at a small country house dinner in late September of 1817. Neither too elaborate nor too plain, exactly correct for the occasion. Mary brings the dress over, holding it up by the shoulders so that the fabric falls in its natural folds. She helps you into it carefully, lifting it over your head and letting it settle down over the petticoat and the stays, smoothing it as it falls. She fastens the small hooks at the back, one by one, working her way up from the lower back to the high waistline. She adjusts the fall of the skirt. She tweaks the small lace trim at the bodice into the position that the cut of the dress required. She steps back to look at you. She nods in the small assessing way and says, "You look well." You say thank you. She moves on. She does your hair next. The hairdressing for evening in a country house in 1817 was, like everything else, less elaborate than it would become in the more decorated styles of the Victorian period, and was certainly less elaborate than the powdered piled-up styles of the 18th century that had gone out of fashion entirely in the past 20 years. The Regency style for evening hair was relatively simple. The hair was parted in the middle, the front sections drawn back to the crown, the back sections drawn up into a knot at the crown, and the whole arrangement softened with small curls or ribbons or, for more formal occasions, small flowers or jewels. Tonight Mary will do the simpler version, with a small white silk ribbon woven through the knot at the crown, and two small soft curls falling at the temples in the style that has been general for the past few years. She takes down your day arrangement first. She removes the pins and the small comb that have held the day style in place. She brushes out your hair, slowly, with the silver-mounted hairbrush from the dressing table. The brushing is slow and careful, with the small steady rhythm that Mary has used each evening since you arrived, and that you have found, each evening, to be one of the small particular pleasures of the dressing. The slow rhythmic brushing produces in the person being brushed a small steady relaxation of the scalp and the small muscles around it, and you have found yourself each evening sinking very slightly into the chair as the brushing went on, with a small interior settling of someone whose body has been weighted on by another body in a slow, careful way. When the brushing is done, she begins to put the hair up for the evening. She separates the front section. She draws it back to the crown. She separates the back section. She draws it up. She pins it carefully with the small slim pins that fix it without showing through the hair. She arranges the front section over the back, drawing it in a soft curve from the part to the crown, and pins that as well. She brings out the hot iron from the small spirit lamp heater on the dressing table, where it has been warming for the past few minutes, and uses it to put the small soft curls at the temples, with the small careful precision of a maid who has been doing this every evening for years, and who knows exactly how long the iron must be applied to each section to produce the soft curl rather than the tighter ringlet. She works the white silk ribbon through the knot at the crown, securing it with a small invisible pin. She steps back. She looks at the arrangement. She nods. She brings the small leather case of jewelry from the dressing table. She opens it. The case contains, tonight, a small string of pearls that you have brought with you for evening wear, a pair of small pearl earrings that match the necklace, and a small enameled bracelet that you wear sometimes but will not wear tonight because it does not go with the primrose yellow dress. Mary takes out the pearls. She fastens the necklace around your throat with the small, careful management of the gold clasp at the back of your neck. She puts the earrings into your ears. She steps back again. She looks at you for a moment in the entirety of your evening dress. She says, in the small voice of approval she uses for these moments, that you look very well. You glance at yourself in the looking glass. You see the small, careful arrangement of the dress, the hair, the pearls, the small, soft curls at the temples. You see the slightly heightened colour in your cheeks that the warm room has produced. You see in the gold candlelight of the dressing table candles the small, rather pleasant figure of a young woman in a primrose yellow evening dress, ready for a country house dinner. You stand up from the dressing table chair. Mary brings the small evening shawl of fine white cashmere with a soft, pale yellow embroidered border that the East India Company had been bringing in from Kashmir since the early years of the century. She lays it over your shoulders. She arranges the fall of the fabric. She steps back. She picks up the small evening reticule of pale yellow silk from the dressing table and places it in your hand. The dressing is done. You glance again in the looking glass. The room around you is now in the deepest, warmest candlelight, with the dressing table candles burning steadily on either side of the looking glass, and the candles on the mantel reflecting back from the small gilt frame of the painting above the fire, and the candles on the small bedside table casting their soft glow over the crimson of the bed hangings. The fire in the grate is now well established, a deep glowing bed of coals with small flames flickering above it. The room is warm. The small interior world of the bedroom, with the curtains drawn against the dim outside and the candles lit and the fire burning, has settled into the small particular evening atmosphere that English country house bedrooms produce at this hour of the day. You thank Mary. You walk to the door. You leave the room. Mary stays behind to tidy the dressing table and to begin the small evening preparation of the bed for the night. In the small private hour she is now alone in the room before you return. Tsutted. The corridor outside your bedroom is dim. The candles in the wall sconces have been lit by the under-housemaid who does the evening lighting of the bedroom corridors, and they cast their small, soft pools of light at intervals along the length of the corridor. The corridor is carpeted in a deep red runner that absorbs the sound of your footsteps as you walk along it. The portraits on the walls between the bedroom doors are dim shapes in the dim light, the faces of various ancestors and connections of the family looking down with the slightly distant 18th century gaze of subjects who had sat for their portraits long ago and were now keeping their long quiet vigil over the corridor of a house. Most of them had never lived in. You walk along the corridor toward the head of the great staircase. The staircase is at the centre of the house, rising from the entrance hall on the ground floor through the full height of the building to a small upper landing that connects to the second floor. It is the principal architectural feature of the interior of the house in the Palladian manner, with a wide central well, a carved oak balustrade running up both sides, and a great glass cupola high above letting in the light from the roof. At this hour, of course, the cupola is dark, with the autumn evening having long since faded, and the staircase is lit only by the candles in the great branching candelabra on the half landing and the smaller wall sconces along the walls. You begin to descend. The carpet runner that covers the centre of the staircase muffles your footsteps. The polished oak of the balustrade is smooth under your hand. You go down slowly, in the small, careful way of a young woman in evening dress who does not want to take a sudden step on a dim staircase. The portraits on the walls of the staircase, well, are larger than the ones in the bedroom corridor, full-length portraits of the previous baronets and their wives in the formal dress of their respective generations. The first baronet, in his long, full-bottomed wig of the 1710s, looking out from his enormous gilt frame with the slightly stiff dignity of an early Hanoverian gentleman who has just been raised to his title and is not yet entirely sure how to wear it. The second baronet, his son, in the slightly lighter wig of the 1740s, with the small, confident smile of a man who had been born into a baronetcy and who knew exactly how to wear it. The third baronet, the grandfather of the present owner, in his powder and queue of the 1770s. The fourth baronet, the present owner, in a portrait that had been done some years ago when he was about 40, looking considerably leaner and considerably less grey than the man you have been having dinner with for the past 3 evenings. The various ladies of the house in their various costumes across the same period. You reach the half landing, you turn the corner, you continue down, you come down the lower flight, with the entrance hall opening up below you, the small checkered marble floor visible through the balustrade, the great central chandelier of cut glass that hangs from a chain in the centre of the hall now lit, and casting its many small reflections from the cut glass facets. The hall at this hour is in the warm, bright candlelight that the chandelier provides, with additional light from the wall sconces and from the small candelabra on the side tables. You come down the last few steps. The footman who has been on duty in the hall for the past hour comes forward to greet you. He is a tall young man of about 23 in the household livery of dark blue with the family crest on the buttons, who has been with the family for about 4 years, and whose name is Thomas. He bows slightly. He says good evening, ma'am, in the small, precise voice he uses for the family's guests. You return the greeting. He stands aside to let you pass. You go through the door at the south end of the entrance hall, which leads into the inner hall, which in turn leads into the principal reception rooms of the first floor. You climb the smaller secondary staircase that takes you up to the level of the great drawing room. You emerge onto the wide landing of the principal floor. The great drawing room of the house is the room directly above the entrance hall, occupying the central block of the south front of the building, with 5 tall sash windows looking south over the lawn and the park. It is a magnificent room. It was redecorated about 10 years ago, in the lighter Regency manner that had come into fashion in the early years of the century, with pale walls of a soft cream colour, white plasterwork picked out in soft pale gold, a great Adam-style chimney-piece of white marble, with the small classical figures of Apollo, and the Muses on its frieze, and the long row of new sabre-legged chairs and small mahogany sofas that the present lady of the house had ordered from a London cabinet maker around 1808. The whole effect is of a room of considerable elegance, in the Regency taste at its best, with the older Palladian bones of the room's architecture providing the steady classical foundation for the lighter, newer decoration. The room is about 50 feet long and 28 feet wide, with a high coved ceiling decorated with delicate plaster ornament in the manner of the brothers Adam, and the long sweep of the room can be divided into 2 slightly distinct social zones by the careful placement of the furniture into 2 clusters around the 2 fireplaces at either end. The cluster at the south end, around the principal fireplace, was Lady Lacy's preferred seating area for evening gatherings, and contained the chair she always took, the sofa where Mrs. Lacy usually sat, and several other chairs arranged in the small, comfortable circle that produced the principal conversation of any evening party. The cluster at the north end, around the second fireplace, was the secondary seating area, used by smaller groups when the party divided, and contained a smaller sofa and several chairs. The pianoforte by Broadwood stood at the very north end of the room, between the second fireplace and the north wall, with a small music stand beside it, and a folder of music laid out on top of the instrument. The pictures on the walls of the great drawing room had been carefully selected and placed by the present lady of the house, when the room had been redecorated in 1808, with the small attentive eye of a country gentlewoman who had been thinking about the arrangement of her drawing room for 30 years. There were several full-length portraits of family members in the slightly more formal locations. The present baronet himself, in a portrait painted by a London portrait painter of moderate reputation in 1798, hung over the principal fireplace, looking down at his guests with the small, confident expression of a man in his late 30s who had recently come into his title. The present lady of the house, in a companion portrait by the same artist, hung over the second fireplace at the north end. Two slightly older portraits of the third baronet and his wife hung on the long wall between the two fireplaces, in the manner of the previous generation watching over the arrangements of the present one. The space between these family portraits was filled with a series of smaller paintings, a small Italian landscape over one of the doors, a small Dutch interior over the other, a pair of small flower paintings on the long wall near the windows, and a single small classical scene of nymphs at a fountain on the wall opposite the fireplaces. None of the paintings was particularly distinguished. All of them were perfectly pleasant. The whole arrangement had the small, careful quality of a country house drawing room in which the family had been collecting moderately well across several generations and had distributed the results across the walls with the small, steady eye of good taste. The carpet on the floor was a large Axminster carpet, made for the room when it was redecorated in 1808, in a pale green and cream pattern with small, soft floral motifs at intervals. The curtains at the 5 south windows were of cream silk damask, tied back with small gold cords, with the slightly heavier blue-green silk under curtains that were drawn for the evening. The candles on the mantels and on the side tables and in the wall sconces and in the chandeliers were all of fine beeswax, the kind that was kept for the principal rooms of the house. The whole room, when fully lit and fully prepared for an evening, had the small particular quality of an English country house drawing room of the Regency at its best: warm, elegant, comfortable, beautifully proportioned, full of the small, steady accumulation of 50 years of country good taste, and capable of producing in its inhabitants the small interior settling that came from being in a perfectly arranged and perfectly lit room. You walk into the drawing room. The room is well lit. The fires in both the grates at either end of the long room are burning steadily. The candles in the wall sconces and on the mantels and on the small side tables are all lit. The chandeliers in the centre of the ceiling are lit. The whole room is in the soft, bright candlelight that a great country house drawing room produced when it was prepared for an evening's reception, with the warm gold glow of perhaps 50 individual candles distributed across the room, and reflecting from the polished surfaces of the furniture and the gilt frames of the pictures and the cut glass of the lustres. The party has begun to gather. Lady Lacy is already in the room, sitting in her usual chair near the fire at the south end. She is in evening dress, of a deeper colour than yours, a wine-coloured silk with darker trim, in the slightly more formal style that an older married lady of her position wore for evening. She is wearing the family pearls, which are larger and more elaborate than yours, and her hair is dressed in the slightly more elaborate evening arrangement that her age and position called for. She greets you warmly when you come in. She compliments you on your dress, which she has not seen before, in the small graceful way of an experienced country hostess who knows the small social value of a noticed and appreciated dress. You return the compliment, more carefully, as the visiting young woman is supposed to. You take the chair near hers. Mrs. Lacy is in the room, on the opposite sofa, in her widow's evening dress of black silk with a small lace collar. She greets you with the small steady warmth of a woman who has known you for 3 days now and who is fond of you. She is doing a small piece of needlework that she has been carrying around with her all visit. You exchange a few small words with her about the day. She mentions that she has had a letter that afternoon from her son in Hampshire. You ask after the son. She tells you he is well, although his eldest boy has been ill with a fever and is keeping the family slightly anxious. You express the appropriate sympathy. The rector comes in. He has come back up from the parsonage and has changed into his evening clothes, which for him means the dark coat and dark waistcoat and dark breeches of his clerical dress, with a small white cravat at his throat. He is the kind of country clergyman who has lived in his parish for the past 30 years and who is now in his slightly comfortable later middle age of moderate education and considerable warmth. The friend of the family in the way that the resident parish clergyman generally was the friend of the resident gentry family. He greets you. He greets Lady Lacy and Mrs. Lacy. He takes a glass of Madeira from the small tray on the side table that the footman has set out. He stands near the fire, talking with Lady Lacy about a small matter of parish business that has come up that afternoon. Mr. Henley comes in. He has changed into his evening clothes, which for him at 26 means the slightly more dandified version of the prevailing male evening dress. A dark blue coat with brass buttons, a white waistcoat, white silk breeches, white silk stockings, black evening pumps, a fine white cravat tied in the slightly elaborate style that the younger men of fashion were tying it in this season. He is a personable young man, of moderate good looks and genuinely good manners, who has been keeping up the social conversation of the visit with the appropriate mix of polite interest in the elder members of the party and slightly more lively interest in Miss York and yourself. He greets you. He takes a glass of Madeira. He joins the conversation at the fire. Miss York comes in. She has changed into a pale blue evening dress, simpler than yours but well cut, with a small string of small pearls and a single white rose pinned in her hair where the knot is fastened. She is 21, the niece of the lady of the house, a slightly shy young woman of moderate prettiness who has been finding her own slow way into the social rhythms of an extended country visit and who has developed, across the past weeks, a small, steady affection for you as the slightly older and more experienced young woman in the house. She comes over and sits by you. She compliments your dress. You return the compliment. The two of you fall into the small, easy conversation that you have established across the past 3 days about a book you have both been reading. The baronet comes in last at about 7:20. He is in his usual evening clothes, which for him are the same general style as Mr. Henley's, but cut more loosely to accommodate his slightly larger frame, and worn with the slightly relaxed air of a country gentleman in his late 50s who is no longer particularly trying to impress and Yon with his dress. He greets the company with the warmth of a country host who is comfortable in his own drawing room. He takes his glass of Madeira from the tray. He goes to the fire and stands with his back to it, in the small habit of country gentlemen at the fire before dinner. He says that he is sorry to have kept everyone waiting, that he had been with his bailiff longer than he had expected. He asks the rector about the small matter of parish business that he had been discussing with Lady Lacy. The conversation moves in his direction. The pre-dinner gathering is now complete. At 7:30, the butler comes to the door of the drawing room and announces, in the small, precise voice that country house butlers used for this announcement, that dinner is served. The party rises. The baronet offers his arm to the rector's wife, who has now arrived from the parsonage to join the dinner, although she had not been at the pre-dinner gathering. Lady Lacy takes the arm of the rector. Mr. Henley takes the arm of Miss York. Mrs. Lacy and you fall in together at the back. The procession moves out of the drawing room, across the wide landing, and down the secondary staircase to the dining room on the ground floor of the south wing. The dining room is a long, handsome room, with 3 windows on the south side now closed and shuttered against the night. A long mahogany table laid for 9 in the centre of the room, a marble fireplace at the west end with a fire burning steadily, and the large family dinner service set out on the table in the pattern that Lady Lacy had instructed earlier in the day. Walls are hung with a deep red flock paper that has been on the walls since the room was redecorated in the 1780s, and that gives the room its slightly heavy formal evening atmosphere. The pictures on the walls are family portraits of the slightly more distant relations of the family. the cousins and the wives of brothers and the various extended members of a country family network. The candles in the silver candelabra along the center of the table, 3 of them with 5 candles each, are lit. The candles in the wall sconces are lit. The room is in the deep, warm, formal candlelight of an English country house dining room at the start of a small private dinner. The seating arrangement at the dinner is the conventional one for a country house dinner of this size. The baronet sits at the head of the table at the east end. Lady Lacy sits at the foot of the table at the west end. The rector sits to Lady Lacy's right. The rector's wife sits to the baronet's right. Mrs. Lacy sits to the baronet's left. Mr. Henley sits next to Mrs. Lacy. Miss York sits next to the rector. You sit between Mr. Henley and the rector, on the side of the table opposite the rector's wife. The dinner that the kitchen has prepared is, for a small private country house dinner in late September, a substantial affair. The dinner of the period was served in 2 courses, with the dessert coming as a 3rd course after the cloth had been removed. The first course consisted of the soup at one end of the table, a fish at the other end, and a series of side dishes distributed along the centre. The second course consisted of the roast meats and the various accompaniments. The dessert consisted of the sweet dishes and the fruit. The whole dinner, when fully served, would last about 2 hours. The first course tonight was opened by a thick game soup made from the previous week's grouse, which was served at Lady Lacy's end of the table by the butler, with the small silver ladle that the family had been using for soup at this table for 50 years. At the baronet's end was a turbot, which had been brought up that afternoon from the fishmonger in the market town, who had received it from London by the morning coach. The fish was served with a lobster sauce that the cook had been particularly proud of. Distributed along the centre of the table were the various side dishes of the first course: a fricassee of chicken in a white sauce, a small dish of stewed mushrooms, a dish of buttered beans from the kitchen garden, a small terrine of potted hare, a dish of pickled walnuts, a small platter of cold ham, and a small dish of stewed apples that the cook had been experimenting with as a savoury accompaniment. And the conversation at dinner moved slowly through the kind of topics that a country house dinner in 1817 produced. The baronet told a small story about a piece of business he had been transacting with one of his neighbouring landowners that morning, a small dispute over a boundary fence that had been going on for nearly 2 years and that had finally, that morning, reached a small, comfortable resolution that left neither party particularly aggrieved. The story was told in the slow, detailed way that the baronet told all his stories, with a small, precise account of which fields were in question, and which tenant of which side had said which thing, and the rector, and Mr. Henley and Mrs. Lacy listened with the appropriate small attention that the host's stories always received at his own dinner table. The rector contributed a piece of news that had come down from London with the afternoon papers about a piece of legislation that was being prepared for the next session of Parliament. The legislation concerned the suspension of the Habeas Corpus Act, which had been suspended earlier in the year because of the disturbances in the manufacturing districts of the north, and the small political agitation that the post-war economic dislocation had been producing. The rector, who was of a slightly more conservative political turn than the baronet, was inclined to think that the suspension was justified by the situation in the country. The baronet, who was of moderate Whig opinions, was inclined to think that the suspension was an alarming precedent and ought not to be continued any longer than absolutely necessary. The conversation between them was conducted with the small, careful courtesy of 2 men who had been disagreeing politely about politics across the same dinner table for 30 years, and who had developed the small, comfortable rhythm of polite politic, disagreement, that allows 2 friends to differ without falling out. Mr. Henley, who was of slightly more advanced political views than either of them, listened with the appropriate respect, and contributed only a single small observation about the state of public feeling in the manufacturing towns that he had passed through on his way south from Yorkshire that summer. Mrs. Lacy described, in slightly more detail than was strictly required, a small series of family events that had been happening in her son's household in Hampshire across the past several weeks. The events involved a christening, a confirmation, and a small dispute with a neighbouring family over a piece of common ground that had been entered into the Local Enclosure Act of the previous year. Mrs. Lacey told the story with the small narrative gift of a woman who had been telling family stories at country dinners for 40 years, and who had developed the small pleasant rhythm that made her listeners willing to follow her even into the more circumstantial passages. Mr. Henley, who had been at the home farm with the baronet earlier in the week and had been impressed by what he had seen, asked the baronet several detailed questions about the agricultural improvements that the baronet had been undertaking across the past 5 years. The baronet, who liked nothing better than talking about his agricultural improvements, answered the questions at considerable length, with the small enthusiastic detail that men who have been thinking about a particular subject for a long time produce when they are given the opportunity to share what they know. The baronet had been, across the past 5 years, in the slow, careful work of modernising the agricultural practices of his estate, in the way that a great many improving English landowners had been engaged in across the past 50 years. He had been draining several of the wetter fields with a system of underground tile drains that he had observed at a neighbour's estate the previous year. He had been replacing the old common field system on the small portion of his estate that still operated on it, with the more modern enclosed field arrangement that the rest of the country had been adopting since the 1760s. He had been experimenting on his own home farm with several of the newer agricultural techniques that the agricultural societies had been promoting. The 4-course rotation that Mr. Coke of Norfolk had been advocating, the new Suffolk plough that turned a deeper furrow with less effort from the plough team, the threshing machine he had recently bought that allowed the threshing of the wheat to be completed in a fraction of the time the old hand threshing had taken. He explained all of this to Mr. Henley with the precision and the warmth that men who have been thinking about agriculture every day for 30 years produce when they speak about it. Mr. Henley, who was a young man of intellectual interests, and was beginning to think that he himself might want to take up the management of his own family's land in due course, listened with the small, careful attention of a younger man absorbing the thinking of an older one. As the Isom and Miss York and you exchanged occasional small remarks across the table to each other, in the small private side conversation that young women at large dinners often kept up, the rector's wife, who was a kind, comfortable woman of about 50, who had been the rector's wife for 30 years, contributed her own small, steady stream of conversation with Lady Lacey at the foot of the table about parish matters and family connections and the small, ongoing concerns of country life. The whole conversation had the gentle, rolling quality of a country house dinner among people who had known each other for a long time and who did not need to make any particular effort to entertain each other, who were content to let the conversation move slowly through its various small channels, and who were enjoying the dinner and each other's company without strain. The second course, when it came, was substantial. There was a saddle of mutton with red currant jelly at the baronet's end. There was a roast pheasant from the previous week's shooting at Lady Lacey's end. There was a brace of partridges, also from the shooting, in the centre of the table. There were several side dishes accompanying the meats. A dish of glazed turnips, a dish of stewed celery, a dish of small new potatoes from the kitchen garden, a dish of buttered French beans, a small dish of sausages that the cook had made from the household's own pigs, and a small dish of stewed mushrooms. There was a tureen of gravy. The wines for the dinner were the conventional sequence. There had been Madeira before dinner. There was hock with the soup and the fish. There was claret with the meats. There would be sherry with the dessert, and port for the gentlemen after the dessert when the ladies had withdrawn. The wines were poured by the butler and the senior footman, who moved silently around the table, refilling the small glasses as they emptied. The baronet, who took a particular interest in his cellar, occasionally made small remarks about the wines as they were served, identifying the year of the claret and the source of the hock. Mr. Henley, who had been studying his own father's cellar, asked the baronet several questions about the management of a country house cellar in general, which the baronet answered with the same enthusiastic detail he had brought to the agricultural improvements. The dessert, which was served after the cloth had been removed in the older fashion that the baronet maintained, consisted of a syllabub, a small dish of stewed plums, preserved peaches from the summer's preserving, a small dish of macaroons, a plate of grapes from the conservatory, a plate of pears from the orchard, a plate of small biscuits, and a small dish of dried fruits and nuts that had been put out for those who wanted something to nibble at the end of the meal. The dessert wine was a sweet sherry that the baronet had brought up from the cellar that morning. The conversation at dessert moved into the slightly more relaxed tone that the end of a long dinner produced. The political topic that the rector had introduced earlier was picked up again, this time with more elaboration, with the baronet contributing his moderate Whig opinion, and the rector contributing his slightly more conservative one, and Mr. Henley contributing the slightly more developed views of a young man who had been at Oxford and had been reading widely. The rector's wife and Lady Lacy continued their parish and family conversation. Mrs. Lacy told a small comic anecdote about an encounter with a tenant's wife in the lane the previous summer. Miss York and you discussed briefly a piece of news from London that had come in a letter to her aunt earlier in the week. By 9:15, the dinner had reached its conclusion. Lady Lacy caught the eye of the rector's wife and the eye of Mrs. Lacy, and the three of them rose. Miss York and you rose with them. The men rose with the women. The women left the dining room and went back upstairs to the drawing room, while the men remained at the table for their port and the small private male conversation that the period thought necessary to a dinner. The baronet poured the port himself in the older fashion, and the four men remaining at the table settled into the small, comfortable hour of post-prandial conversation that English country house dinners produced. The drawing room, when the women returned to it, was the same warm, bright room they had left 2 hours earlier. The fires had been built up while they were at dinner. Fresh candles had been lit in the candelabra. The teapot on the small table near Lady Lacy's chair was steaming gently, having been brought up from the kitchen by one of the housemaids while the women were on the stairs. The whole room was prepared for the small, slow, comfortable hour of after-dinner sociability that country house drawing rooms specialized in. Lady Lacy took her chair at the fire. Mrs. Lacy took her usual sofa. The rector's wife took the chair opposite Lady Lacy. Miss York and you took the small two-person sofa near the second fire at the north end of the room. Lady Lacy poured the tea, in the small careful ritual she conducted each evening at this hour, with the small individual cups and saucers being passed by the senior housemaid who had stayed in the room to serve. The tea, like the morning chocolate, was of the better quality that the family kept for evening, with the small, steady fragrance of good Chinese tea that the household had been buying from the same London merchant for 30 years. Lady Lacy asked Miss York whether she would play. Miss York, who had been somewhat dreading the question all evening because she was not particularly confident at the pianoforte, said that she would. The drawing room had a fine pianoforte at the north end, a square pianoforte by the London maker Broadwood, which the present lady of the house had bought new in 1804, and which was kept in good tune by the local piano tuner, who came up from the market town twice a year. Miss York went to the pianoforte. She sat down. She took out from the small folder of music that she carried with her on her visits a small piece by Mozart that she had been working at all summer, and she played it with the small, careful, slightly self-conscious precision of a young woman who knew she was not a brilliant player, but who could carry off a piece for a small private audience without embarrassing herself. The audience listened politely. The piece ended. Miss York received the polite small applause of country house drawing rooms. She played a second piece, a slightly easier one, a small song without words that she had been playing since she was about 15, and that she could play without nervousness. The room received it with the same polite warmth. She rose from the pianoforte. She returned to the sofa beside you. The men came in shortly afterward, at about 10:15. They came in together. The baronet went to his usual chair near Lady Lacy. The rector took the chair next to his wife. Mr. Henley came over to the second fire where you and Miss York were sitting, and took the chair opposite the small sofa, in the small, comfortable way of a young man who knew his welcome in this part of the room. The conversation expanded to include the men. The party fell into the small subdivisions that country house drawing rooms produced after dinner. Lady Lacy and the rector's wife and Mrs. Lacy and the baronet and the rector formed one conversation at the south end of the room around the principal fire. Mr. Henley and Miss York and you formed another at the north end, around the second fire. The two conversations ran in parallel for the next hour or so, each in its own slow, comfortable rhythm. The conversation at your end of the room turned after a few minutes to a recent novel that Mr. Henley had been reading, and that Miss York had also read. It was Mr. Walter Scott's novel of the previous year, The Antiquary, which had been the great literary success of the summer of 1816, and which all three of you had read with enthusiasm. The conversation moved through the various small features of the novel that you all admired, the comic management of the antiquary himself, the small scenes of Scottish life that Mr. Scott described with such precision, the strange affecting subplot involving the German adventurer at the end. Mr. Henley, who had been reading more of Mr. Scott's novels in sequence, gave you and Miss York a small precis of the previous novels that you had not yet read, Waverley and Guy Mannering, with the small enthusiasm of a young man who had just discovered an author and was eager to share him. The conversation widened. Mr. Henley said that he had heard from a friend in London that Mr. Scott was understood to be working on a new novel that would be published in the winter, and that the new novel was set in the Scottish Highlands at a slightly later period than Waverley. He had been told that the title was to be Rob Roy, after the famous Scottish outlaw of the early 18th century. He had, he said, been particularly looking forward to it. Miss York said that she had been told the same thing by her cousin, who had a relation in Edinburgh, who was somehow connected with Mr. Scott's circle of Edinburgh literary friends. The two of you exchanged the small, comfortable speculations about the new book that the readers of an admired author always exchange when they are waiting for the next work. Miss York then asked Mr. Henley what he had thought of the strange identity of the author of these novels, who had so far been publishing them anonymously. The novels had been appearing since 1814 with no author's name on the title page, and the public had been speculating across the past 3 years about who the author might be. Mr. Scott himself, the great Edinburgh poet and antiquarian, was the most widely suspected candidate, but he had not himself confirmed the identification, and the small mystery of the so-called author of Waverley had been one of the small literary topics of the past few seasons. Mr. Henley said that he was almost entirely certain it was Scott, on the basis of internal evidence in the novels themselves, the deep knowledge of Scottish history and topography, the particular interest in old ballads and old customs that matched what was known of Scott's antiquarian interests, and the small quality of the prose itself, which had reminded him of the prose of Scott's introductions to the editions of older Scottish poetry that he had been bringing out for some years. Miss York agreed. You agreed. The conversation moved, then, into a discussion of other recent novels. Miss York had been reading the novel Emma, which had appeared in the previous year by an unnamed author whom her aunt had been told was a clergyman's daughter from Hampshire, although neither Miss York nor anyone else seemed quite certain of this. Mr. Henley had not read Emma, but had read the same author's earlier novel Pride and Prejudice, which had appeared in 1813, and which he had enjoyed considerably. The two of them discussed the small, careful comic precision of the unnamed author's writing, the way the author managed her small social scenes with such exact observation, The way the dialogue captured the small actual texture of country drawing room conversation in a way that almost no other novelist had managed. You contributed your own small enthusiasm for Pride and Prejudice, which you had read twice, and for the earlier novel Sense and Sensibility, which you had read once when it had appeared in 1811 and had liked considerably. Miss York said that she had heard, in fact, that the author had recently died, in the summer just past, somewhere in Hampshire, although the news was unconfirmed and might be incorrect. The three of you sat for a moment with the small possibility of the news, in the small, uncertain way that one sits with the possible death of an admired author whom one has never met. The conversation moved on. Mr. Henley, who had been reading widely across the past summer, also told you and Miss York about a recent volume of poems by Mr. Coleridge that had appeared in the previous year, called Christabel and Other Poems, which had divided the critics, but which he had himself liked. You had not read it. Miss York, who liked Gothic novels, said that she would try to find a copy. You said that you would too. The conversation continued in this small, comfortable literary channel for nearly half an hour, with the three of you exchanging the small enthusiasms and recommendations that young readers in 1817 exchanged at country house dinners, in the small, steady cultural conversation of a generation that had been formed by the new novels and poems that had been appearing across the past 10 years. You contributed your own small observations. Miss York contributed hers. The conversation moved easily. The fire burned steadily. The room settled into its late evening rhythm. At about 11:15, the baronet, at the other fire, said in his usual slightly slow voice that he thought he would go up. He said good night to the company. His lady went with him, in the small habitual way of country house couples who went up together. The rector's wife rose. The rector rose. They said their good nights. They left the house, the rector's wife wrapped in her shawl against the cool autumn air outside, the rector with his lantern lit by the footman at the door, the small, comfortable couple walking back down the avenue toward the parsonage that they had been walking back to from the great house for 30 years. The party in the drawing room was now reduced to 4. Mrs. Lacey was still on her sofa, doing her needlework. Miss York and you were still on the small sofa at the north fire. Mr. Henley was still in the chair opposite. The room was quieter, with the principal voices having gone up. The candles were burning slightly lower. Mrs. Lacey, after a few more minutes, put down her needlework and said that she would go up too. She rose. She said good night to the three of you. She left the room. Miss York, Mr. Henley, and you remained. The three of you sat for another 20 minutes. The conversation continued in its slow, easy way, on the same literary topic, and then drifting into a small discussion of Mr. Henley's plans for his return to Oxford the following week, and then into a small discussion of Miss York's plans for her own return to her family's house. Once the repairs were complete, the conversation had the slightly intimate quality that country house drawing room conversations took on after the elder members of the party had gone up, when the three young people remaining could speak slightly more freely without the small social constraints of the larger party. By 11:15, all three of you were ready to go up. Miss York yawned, slightly, in the small, unaffected way she had, and said that she should go to bed. You agreed. Mr. Henley stood up. The three of you went together to the door of the drawing room. You said your good nights to each other in the small, comfortable way of a small house party that had been together for several days. Mr. Henley went off to his room in the east wing. Miss York and you went together to the head of the great staircase. You took your bedroom candle from the small table where the candles had been set out for the night by the under-footman who managed the candle arrangements at this hour. Each candle had a small note in front of it, with the name of the room it belonged to, written in the housekeeper's neat hand. Sir John Lady, Mrs. Lacey, Miss York, Mr. Henley, and your own name. Miss York took hers. The two of you walked down the corridor together as far as her room, which was 3 doors before yours. She kissed you on the cheek. in the small, affectionate way that she had developed across the past 3 days. She said good night. She went into her room. The door closed quietly behind her. You walked the rest of the way to your own room. The corridor was quiet. The wall sconces were still burning, although they would be put out by the night footman in the next half hour as the household settled for the night. You reached your door. You opened it. You went in. Mary was waiting. She had been in the room for the past hour, doing the small evening preparation of the bed for the night, and was now ready to undress you. The room was warm. The fire in the grate had been built up while you were at dinner, and was now burning steadily with the small, bright glow of well-established coals. The candles around the room were burning steadily. The bed had been turned down, the heavy crimson day cover folded back to the foot of the bed, the white linen sheets and the soft wool blankets visible underneath, the pillows arranged for the night with the small additional bolster placed across the head of the mattress. The brass warming pan that Mary used to warm the bed each night was in place at the side of the fire, where she had heated it across the past hour, and had been used 20 minutes ago to pass through the bed in the small, slow, careful way that warming pans were used to take the cold out of country house beds in the autumn. Mary helped you out of the primrose yellow evening dress. She unhooked the small fastenings at the back. She lifted the dress carefully off your shoulders, drew it down over your arms, gathered it up at your feet. She hung it on the dressing form. She would, in the morning, brush it carefully and hang it back in the wardrobe. She took down your hair. She unwound the white silk ribbon from the knot. She removed the pins. The hair fell in its loose evening fall around your shoulders. She brushed it out slowly, in the same careful, rhythmic way she had brushed it before dinner. She braided it for the night in a single thick plait that she finished with a small cotton ribbon at the end. She unfastened the pearls. She returned them to the small leather case. She put the case in the dressing table drawer. She helped you out of the petticoat. She unlaced the stays. The nightdress was of fine white cambric with a small lace trim at the neck and at the cuffs, with a small drawstring at the high neckline that closed it against the cold. She tied the drawstring carefully. She helped you into the small dressing gown of soft white wool that had been laid out across the chair by the fire, and which you would wear for the few minutes between getting into the nightdress and getting into the bed. She had brought up, at the start of the evening, the small jug of fresh hot water that you used for washing your face before bed. She poured it now into the basin on the washstand. You washed your face, with the small, slow pleasure of warm water on tired skin at the end of a long day. You patted it dry with the small towel she handed you. She took the basin and the towel away. She brought the small cup of warm milk that she had been keeping warm by the fire on a small spirit lamp. The warm milk before bed was a small habit you had developed in the past few months, on the recommendation of an aunt of yours who had recommended it for general health, and Mary had been bringing it up each evening since you arrived. You took the cup. You sat in the chair by the fire to drink it slowly, with the small pleasure of the warmth on your hands and the warmth in your throat. Mary, while you drank the milk, did the last small tasks of the evening. She put the dress in the wardrobe. She tidied the dressing table, putting away the brush and the pins and the small jars of cream. She blew out the candles on the dressing table, leaving only mantle and the small bedside candle burning. She glanced around the room to check that everything was as it should be for the night. She came back to the chair where you were sitting. She asked if there was anything else you needed. You said no, that everything was perfect, and thanked her. She made a small bow, in the slightly old-fashioned way that the senior chambermaids of this house had been trained in. She said good night. She left the room. The door closed quietly behind her. You were alone. You sat in the chair for a few more minutes, finishing the last of the warm milk. The room was very warm now. The fire had been built up well by Mary in your absence, and was at its peak warmth. The candles on the mantel cast their soft glow over the room. and you sat looking at the small pleasant disorder of the dressing table where Mary's evening tidying had left the few things that needed to remain out for the morning. The silver hairbrush, the small jar of cream you used at the temples before sleep, the small glass of water in case you wanted it in the night, the flowers in the small porcelain vase on the mantel, which one of the housemaids had brought up that morning from the conservatory, were a small bunch of late chrysanthemums in soft autumnal yellows and bronzes, and they were releasing their faint, slightly bitter scent into the warm air of the room. The fire was throwing its slow, soft glow across the bed, across the carpet, across the lower half of the room, while the upper reaches near the high-coved ceiling remained in dimmer dimness. The whole room had taken on the small particular quality that bedrooms in great country houses took on at this last hour of the evening, with the day fully ended, and the night fully arrived, and the small interior space prepared in every detail for the long sleep. You sat with the cup in your hand. You looked, slowly, around the room. You looked at the small Italian landscape over the fire, with the figures in the foreground now barely visible in the dim firelight. You looked at the Turkish carpet on the floor, the deep reds and blues catching the firelight in their small worn way. You looked at the bed with its turned-down sheets, waiting. You looked at the long curtains drawn across the south windows, holding the dark world outside at bay. You looked at the wallpaper in the soft, pale green damask, the small pattern just visible in the firelight on the wall opposite the fire. You looked at the small fireplace chair you were sitting in, with its deep red wool upholstery and its small carved arms and its small clawed feet. You looked at all of it, slowly, in the small last act of paying attention to a room before falling asleep in it. The room held you. The whole house held the room. The whole estate held the house. The whole country held the estate. You were inside at this moment the deep-nested set of containers that the country house provided for its inhabitants, with each container held inside the next larger one, all the way out to the sky and the dark autumn night above the dark autumn country. You finished the milk. You set the cup on the small side table. You stood up. You walked over to the bed. You took off the dressing gown and laid it over the back of the chair by the bed. You climbed up the small wooden steps. You got into the bed. The bed was warm. The warming pan had done its work. The sheets were the smooth, soft Irish linen that Lady Lacy kept for the principal guest beds. The blankets were of fine, soft wool, the kind that the Welsh mills had been producing for the great country houses for 60 years. The pillows were of fine down. The whole bed was, at this moment, the small particular kind of comfort that English country houses produced for their guests at the end of a long, quiet day. You lay back. You pulled the blankets up to your chin. The bed curtains were partly open at the foot, in the way you had been leaving them each night, with the small view of the room visible through the gap. You blew out the small bedside candle, which was the last one burning in the room, the candles on the mantel having gone out a few minutes earlier. The room went into the warm, dim glow of the firelight, with only the steady, slow flickering of the fire in the grate giving any light. You lay in the bed for a while in the firelight, doing nothing. The bed was warm. The room was warm. The blankets were heavy in the comforting way that thick blankets were heavy. The pillow was soft under your head. Your body, which had been moving through the small steady tasks of the day for the past 16 hours, settled into the bed with the slow unwinding that bodies do when they are finally given the chance to be still. You listened. The house at this hour was almost entirely quiet. The small distant sounds you could hear were the faint last sounds of the household settling for the night. A door closing, very far away. A small set of footsteps on a back stair, probably the night footman making his rounds to put out the last of the corridor candles. The small soft sound of the wind outside, very faintly, against the windows. The small steady sound of the fire in the grate. The slow occasional crack of a coal as it shifted. the small dry whisper of the flames, the clock in the entrance hall striking midnight, the chime carrying up through the house in the same way it had carried up at 6 in the evening, faint and distinct. Beyond those small near sounds there was the larger silence of the country at night. The country in 1817 was, in a way that is now almost impossible to recover, profoundly quiet at night. There was no traffic on the lanes after the last lamps were lit in the village. There was no machinery of any kind. There were no street lamps, no electricity, no motors of any sort. The only sounds in the country at night were the small natural sounds of the countryside itself, the wind in the trees, the occasional call of an owl from the woods, the small faint distant sound of a fox somewhere in the deep park, the small trickle of the stream that ran into the lake. These sounds were not at this distance, and through the closed shuttered windows, audible inside the bedroom, but they were the sounds that filled the larger space of the night outside, and you knew they were there, in the way that one knows the sounds of a country one has been living in for a few days. The whole world at this moment had drawn into the small steady stillness that the country at night produced. The house was settling for the night. The household was going to bed, room by room, candle by candle. The village beyond the park gates was already asleep, the few lights you had seen through the window earlier in the evening having gone out one by one across the past several hours. The countryside around for miles was asleep. The whole small region of England that you were lying in the centre of had settled into its long, quiet country night, with you in the middle of it, in the warm bed, in the warm room, in the great, quiet house. You let yourself sink into it. The bed held you, the room held you, the house held you, the country held you. The whole small, careful arrangement of comfort that the country house provided for its guests had been performing its slow, steady work all evening, and was now, in this final stage, providing the deep, enclosed safety of sleep. You thought briefly, in the small drifting way of someone settling towards sleep, about the day, about the morning walk in the gardens with the autumn freshness in the air, about the morning in the library writing letters, about the lunch with the family, about the long, slow walk down to the lake, about the tea and the dressing for dinner and the dinner itself, about the conversations, the laughs, the small, careful, steady texture of a day lived among kind people in a comfortable house. You thought about Mr. Henley telling you about Mr. Walter Scott's novels with such enthusiasm. You thought about Miss York playing the small Mozart piece on the pianoforte with her slightly nervous, careful precision. You thought about the baronet at dinner explaining his agricultural improvements. You thought about Lady Lacy pouring the tea. You thought about Mary doing your hair. You thought about the rector going home with his lantern at the end of the evening. You thought about all of these small, steady, comfortable things in the slow drifting way of late thoughts, with each thought arising and being held briefly and being let go, and the next one arising in its place, in the small mental rhythm that the body produces as it drifts towards sleep. You felt your body settling, the small lust tensions of the day, in the small places they had accumulated across the day, eased one by one. The small alertness of social attention that you had been holding all evening relaxed. The small focus of the eyes on small things, small dresses, small movements, small expressions, eased into the unfocused dark. The body, finally, after its long day, began to fall. You were aware in the last small moments before sleep of the warmth of the bed, the softness of the pillow, the steady, distant glow of the firelight through your closed eyelids, the slow, even sound of your own breathing, the deep, enclosed safety of the room around you. You were aware, in some larger way, of the house around the room, the household around the house, the park around the household, the country around the park. You were aware of being held by all of this in the small, particular completeness of an English country house night in late September of 1817, with the harvest brought in, and the autumn beginning, and the long, quiet country night settling over everything. You slept. The fire in the grate burned down slowly, across the next hour, into a deep bed of glowing coals that gave off a steady, gentle warmth that would last most of the night. The candles on the mantel had been put out by Mary before she left. The bedside candle had been put out by you when you got into bed. The room was lit only by the slow red glow of the fire, which gradually dimmed across the next hour but did not go out. The household, room by room, fell into its sleep. Lady Lacy, in the great state bedroom in the centre of the south front, was already asleep, with the small, soft snoring she had been doing for the past 30 years carrying very faintly through the wall. The baronet, in his own apartments next door, was asleep in his own slightly louder country gentleman's snoring. Mrs. Lacy, in her room down the corridor, was asleep with her small white nightcap pulled down over her ears against the cool of the night. Miss York, in her own room 3 doors before yours, was asleep in the deep way of a healthy young woman of 21. Mr. Henley, in his room in the east wing, was asleep with his book still open on the bedside table and the candle still burning beside him because he had fallen asleep while reading. The servants in the upper attics were asleep in their small narrow beds. The night footman was making his last round of the principal floor, putting out the last of the wall candles before going down to his small chair near the entrance hall door where he would sit for the night. The whole great house, with its 40 servants and its small house party, and its 8 or 10 visiting relations, and its various dogs in their kennels in the stable yard, and its horses in their stalls, and its cattle in the home farm fields beyond, and its tenants in their cottages across the estate, and its rector in the parsonage, and its gardener in the small cottage at the end of the kitchen garden, and its various other attendants in their various lodgings, had drawn into the deep country sleep that Hanoverian England fell into each night in the small hours. The owl, deep in the park, called once. A fox, somewhere far off in the home farm woods, gave its small sharp bark. The wind, very faintly, moved in the leaves of the beech avenue. The stream, running into the lake, made its small steady trickle. The country, in its vast late September quiet, held the house and the household in the small particular kind of stillness that the country at night had been holding country houses in for centuries, and would continue to hold them in for some decades more before the changes of the next century began to alter the texture of the quiet. Sleep with that quiet around you. Sleep with the warm bed and the warm room and the warm house and the warm country. Sleep with the candles all out, and the fire burning slowly down, and the small steady safety of an English country house in 1817, holding you in its deep practiced care. I want to spend the last few minutes of this listening, if you are still with me at all, on a small reflection on what an evening like this meant. Not in a way that requires your attention, just as a small, slow-speaking voice continuing as you drift, the way a friend might continue talking at the foot of the bed as you fell asleep, knowing that you would only half hear, knowing that the words were not meant to keep you awake, but to ease you the rest of the way into sleep. The country house in Regency England was, among other things, an enormous machine for producing comfort. That sounds like a slightly cold way of putting it, but it is, when you look closely at how country houses actually worked, the most accurate way of putting it. The whole vast establishment, with its dozens of servants and its many specialized functions and its long-developed routines, existed in order to produce, for a small number of people, the kind of comfort that the period understood as the highest form of civilized life. The fires built up, the candles lit, the food prepared, the beds warmed, the dresses laid out, the water heated, the tea brewed, the rooms cleaned, the horses fed, the gardens kept, the library dusted. The whole machinery worked steadily, day in and day out, year in and year out, to produce the small steady stream of comforts that made up the daily life of the family and their guests. The cost of producing this comfort was, of course, considerable. The country house establishment was supported by the rents of the estate's tenants, who paid for the comfort of the great house with the labour of their fields. The servants who staffed the establishment worked long hours for relatively low wages in the strict hierarchy of below-stairs life that had its own complex internal world but that produced, for the family upstairs, the experience of being perfectly attended to. The whole social arrangement that allowed the country house to function was an arrangement of considerable inequality, and the small comforts that I have been describing all evening were comforts that depended, at every step, on the labour of people whose own lives contained considerably less comfort than the lives of the people they served. I do not say this to spoil the evening. I say it because the country house experience is most interesting, I think, when one understands what it actually was, rather than the vaguer romantic version that the modern imagination tends to settle for. The romantic version is the country house as a place of unalloyed pleasure. The actual country house was a place of pleasure for a small number of people, produced by the labour of a much larger number, in a social arrangement that the period accepted as natural and that the next century would slowly begin to question. The pleasure was real. The labour that produced it was real. Both were features of the same complicated arrangement. What I find most interesting about the country house when I think about it is not the inequality, although the inequality is the obvious feature, but the quality of the comfort itself. The country house produced a particular kind of comfort that no later form of accommodation has quite reproduced. It was a comfort built on slowness, attention, completeness, and continuity. The slowness, because nothing happened quickly. The meals took hours, the dressing took an hour, the journey took days, the visit took weeks. The attention, because every small need was anticipated by someone who had been thinking about it. The fire built before you came up to the room, the warming pan passed through the bed before you got into it, the milk warmed before you asked for it. The completeness, because the country house provided in itself for almost everything its inhabitants needed. Food, warmth, light, water, society, music, books, fresh air, exercise, prayer, sleep. The continuity, because the routines had been running for 60 or 80 or 100 years with very small adjustments across the decades, and the long-established rhythm of the household had a settling effect on the people who entered it. You did not have to invent the day at a country house. The day invented itself. You simply lived inside it. The combination of these four qualities produced, for the people who experienced country house life, a particular kind of deep restoration that was very specific to this form of living. It was not exciting. It was not dramatic. It was simply, in the most steady and complete sense, restful. The body was attended to. The mind was given small pleasant occupations. The social life was warm without being demanding. The natural world was present in all the right doses. The small steady safety of the establishment held you inside it. This is, I think, why the country house has continued to occupy the imagination of subsequent periods, long after the actual country house economy ceased to exist in anything like its 18th century form. The country house, in the romantic memory of subsequent generations, became the figure of a kind of restoration that the modern world stopped being able to provide. Modern life, with its speed and its distraction and its lack of quiet and its absence of long-settled routines, produced people who were, in many cases, exhausted in ways that the inhabitants of the country house were not. The desire to spend a quiet evening in a grand country estate is, in part, the desire to be somewhere that operates on the older, slower scale, where the small interior settling that comes from being properly attended to in a properly running house can be allowed to happen. The house, after you leave it next week, will continue running through the rest of its year in the same small, steady way it has been running through your visit. The autumn will deepen across October and November. The leaves on the avenue of beech trees will fall in their slow turning, and the gardener and his apprentices will rake them up across the long mornings. The shooting season will properly begin. The baronet and Mr. Henley, who will be back at Oxford by then, will not shoot together this year, but the baronet will entertain his other shooting friends across the autumn weekends. The home farm will finish the last of the autumn ploughing. The hunting season will begin in November, and the baronet will hunt twice a week with the local hunt across the winter. Christmas will come, and the family will gather for the small annual celebration that the house held every year, with the children of the elder son and the elder daughter coming up from their own homes for the festivities. The 12th night party that the family had been holding for 3 generations will be held in the great drawing room. The new year will begin. January and February will be the deep cold winter months when the house was at its most enclosed, with the snow on the park and the fires built up high in every grate, and the small enclosed indoor life of midwinter at its full intensity. March will bring the first signs of spring. By April the daffodils will be out along the avenue, and the family will be preparing for the move to London for the season. May and June will be the London months, with most of the family at the Berkeley Square townhouse, and only a skeleton staff at the country estate. The year will turn, the estate will continue. By the following September, the family will be back. The small house party will reassemble in some new combination. The autumn rhythms will resume. The house, in this small, steady way, has been running for nearly 100 years. It will continue running, with small adjustments, for at least another 100. Each year the rhythms will turn through the same shape, with each season bringing its own small distinctive activities, and the long succession of years will accumulate slowly into the long history of an English country estate. You will not, of course, be there for most of it. Your visit is a single small thread woven into a much larger fabric. The autumn of 1817 in this house is one autumn out of many that this house has held and will hold. Your evening tonight is one evening among the tens of thousands of evenings that the house has produced and will produce. The small, slow, pleasant texture of your day, the morning in the gardens and the letters in the library and the lake walk and the dressing and the dinner and the drawing room and the going up to bed, has been produced for many other guests across the past century, and will be produced for many other guests across the next century, in the small, unchanging way that great country houses produced their slow, steady comforts decade after decade. You cannot, of course, actually go there. The country house of 1817 does not exist anymore. The houses themselves still stand, in many cases, but they have been turned into hotels or museums or open house attractions, or are kept by the descendants of the original owners with very different establishments and very different routines than the original. The world that produced the country house experience is gone, along with the social arrangements that made it possible. What remains is the imagination of it, the memory of it, the small reconstruction of it in stories like this one. But the imagination of it, the memory of it, the small reconstruction of it in stories can still produce something of the original effect. The body, when one imagines being properly cared for, relaxes in some of the same ways the body of an actual country house guest relaxed. The mind, when one imagines the slow, steady texture of a long, quiet day, settles in some of the same ways. The deep, restful safety of an old house in a quiet countryside, even when one is only imagining it, has some of the same effect as actually being in such a house. This is, I think, why people listen to stories like this when they are trying to fall asleep. Not because they think they are going to be transported into the past, but because the imagination of the past, when the past is imagined accurately, produces some of the same restoration that the actual past produced. I hope this evening has produced some of that for you. I hope as you have been listening that the slow, steady texture of the imagined day has settled around you in some of the same way it would have settled around an actual guest. The morning in the gardens, the library, the lake, the tea, the dressing, the dinner, the drawing room, the going up to bed, the fire in the grate, the warm sheets, the deep country quiet outside, the small, full completeness of the country house at the end of a long, quiet autumn day. I want, before I let you sleep, to leave you with one small thought. The thought is this: the kind of comfort that the country house produced was not, in the end, a matter of luxury. It was a matter of attention. The country house, when it worked at its best, was a place where every small detail of the day had been thought about by someone who cared enough to think about it, and where the small, steady accumulation of well-thought-about details produced the experience of being simply well attended to. The fire built up before you came up, the candles lit at the right hour, the bed warmed at the right time, the food prepared with care, the conversation made warm by the host's interest in his guests. The whole evening organized so that you, the guest, did not need to organize anything for yourself. You simply moved through the evening, and the evening took care of you. That kind of attention is rare in any era. The country house was, in its way, an institution that specialized in producing it. The modern world produces it less consistently, although it can still be found in particular small forms, in a good restaurant, in a good hotel, in a hospitable home, in the small care that a kind person takes when they are looking after you for an evening. The desire for it, however, is permanent. The desire to be well attended to have one's small needs anticipated, to be received into a place that is prepared for one, to be given a warm room and a good meal and quiet company and a soft bed at the end of the day, is one of the most basic human desires, and the country house simply organized itself around producing it more completely than any other social form had managed to do. Tonight, in the listening, you have been received into such a place. The fire is burning low. The house is asleep around you. The country is asleep beyond the house. The whole world has settled into the small, steady completeness of an evening at a country house in late September of 1817, with you at the center of it, well attended to, well sheltered, well warmed, well looked after. Sleep with all of that around you. Sleep with the small, steady knowledge that you have been, for the past few hours, in a place where every small detail was prepared for you by people who had been preparing such details for years, in a house that had been doing exactly this for nearly a century, in a country that was, in its slow autumn quiet, the deepest country there was. Sleep with the soft pillow under your head and the warm blankets over you and the fire burning low in the grate and the candles all out and the bed curtains partly drawn and the long peaceful country night holding the house and the household and you in its slow practiced care. Thank you for spending this evening with me. Thank you for letting me take you into the warm rooms and the slow texture of a country house in 1817. Thank you for letting the imagined comfort do its small, steady work on the actual body in the actual bed where you are lying tonight, wherever that bed is, in whatever country, in whatever century. The body responds to imagined warmth, almost as it responds to real warmth. The mind responds to imagined safety almost as it responds to real safety. The slow, steady descriptions of fires lit and beds warmed and meals prepared and rooms cared for produce, in the listener, some of the same easing that those things produced in the people who experienced them. That is the small, modest gift of stories like this one. They are not real, but they are not nothing. Good night, then. Good night from the dim, warm room with the fire burning low. Good night from the great, quiet house with the household asleep around you. Good night from the September country in the long autumn quiet, with the harvest in and the year turning, and the small particular peace of the year's slow ending settling over everything. Sleep well.